When the girl delivered breakfast to her fiancé, she discovered another woman lying in his bed. Faced with her fiancé's repeated betrayals, Na Lan completely gave up on the idea of marriage. However, what she never could have imagined was that the next day, her fiancé Jean Fei would have the nerve to show up at her company. He even brought a group of people with him and stormed into the conference room. Despite Na Lan's repeated requests not to disrupt her work, Jean Fei insisted on discussing their future together. He rudely kicked all the clients out of the meeting room. Then, in front of the entire company, he tried to apologize to Na Lan by playing the violin. Unfortunately, Na Lan found his seemingly romantic apology utterly contemptible. Jean Fei's domineering and ruthless behavior left Na Lan completely helpless. Her assistant Wen Di had no choice but to let her go and deal with her personal matters first, leaving the next client to herself. After all, the whole company had to watch Jean Fei's mood. Na Lan thought that marrying a scumbag like him was absolutely impossible. Wen Di's views were also very extreme. She even thought that Jean Fei was already being very generous by apologizing to Na Lan given his current status. Under the influence of her assistant, Na Lan decided to give Jean Fei another chance to explain himself. Unexpectedly, Jean Fei not only failed to realize his mistake, but also blamed Na Lan for not giving him face. Just like that, he took out a gift as usual and contemptuously said that the matter was over. His out-of-touch apology instantly made Na Lan decide not to compromise anymore. So Na Lan proposed breaking up and left without looking back. But for Jean Fei, 8 years of love wasn't something he could just let go of. Therefore, he had no choice but to ask his wealthy father, Jin Xinghua, to intervene. Jin Xinghua also took his son's emotional crisis very seriously. This not only concerned his son's future, but it was also a golden opportunity to win over Na Lan's father. To win Na Lan's forgiveness, Jin Xinghua had originally planned to bring some gifts, but then he turned around and said he didn't know what to buy. After all, Jean Fei had made a big mistake, and his family had to show some gesture of apology. Jin Xinghua was willing to give Na Lan 30% of the company's shares. Na Lan's father naturally refused outright. Na Lan, furious, stormed back into her room. At this moment, Jin Xinghua gave Jean Fei a look. Seeing this, Jean Fei hurriedly followed after him. He then claimed that the 3 million shares were worth more than 1 billion yuan. This time, his father had come with sincerity, hoping that Na Lan would give him face. Na Lan said that she was wrong. Just like that, the two families parted on bad terms. Before leaving, Jin Xinghua left the mature and steady butler Wu with Jean Fei. First, to help Jean Fei establish his career. Second, to help him discipline his rebellious son, but the main purpose was for Na Lan. However, what the father and son never expected was that their plan would be ruined by a poor young man. This man named Guai Xian was rushing to divorce his wife, but as soon as he entered the door, he was punched by his wife's younger brother. Guai Xian knew that he owed his wife a lot of money due to his repeated business failures. Feeling guilty, he chose to leave with nothing, without a company or a family. Guai Xian suddenly became destitute. His only hope was to find an investment company. If the project was approved by the investment company, he might have a chance to make a comeback. However, while he was waiting, investment analyst Na Lan suddenly encountered harassment from a scumbag man. She had no choice but to deal with her personal matters first. Na Lan handed Guai Xian over to her assistant to take care of him. In the office, Guai Xian brought the internet software developed by his company and introduced it to Wen Di. Unexpectedly, Wen Di pointed out the shortcomings of the software. This left Guai Xian speechless. However, before leaving, he still wanted Wen Di's business card. But to his surprise, Wen Di searched everywhere and realized she hadn't brought her business card. With no other option, she casually handed Guai Xian Na Lan's business card. It was this seemingly casual gesture that ultimately led to a huge misunderstanding. With the investment opportunity gone, his last hope was shattered. Guai Xian set off alone on his cycling journey to Tibet. Under the blue sky and white clouds, his mood gradually improved. He accidentally saw Na Lan's business card in his notebook. Remembering her gentle smile, he couldn't help but dial the number on the card. Guai Xian enthusiastically introduced himself and said that he was currently calling her from a plateau 5,000 meters above sea level. He even enthusiastically shared his social media accounts and asked Na Lan to follow him. But Na Lan found this a little strange. She didn't remember ever meeting such a person, but when she got back, she checked Guai Xian's social media. Finally, she realized that there were actually such silly people in this world. Early the next morning, Guai Xian called Na Lan again. He said that he was going to report his daily experiences and thoughts in Tibet to Na Lan. Suddenly, Na Lan found Guai Xian very interesting. She even smiled happily. In the days that followed, she would chat with Gui Xian about life on the bus and discuss work with him during office hours. As they chatted, a subtle change began to occur in their relationship. One day, Gui Xian suddenly came up with the idea of challenging the uninhabited area. He sent this idea to Na Lan in a message. He then set off on his bike and arrived at Death Valley. However, when he reached a hillside, he was suddenly attacked by a pack of wolves. At that critical moment, fortunately, a monk happened to pass by and successfully helped him out of danger. Under the monk's guidance, Gui Xian spent a week successfully crossing the Valley of Death. However, when he returned to his residence and connected to the internet, he discovered that Na Lan had left him 4 voice messages during his absence. After listening to the messages, Gui Xian immediately called Na Lan to let her know he was safe. Na Lan immediately confronted him, asking why he hadn't replied to her messages or answered her calls. Gui Xian felt the warmth of Na Lan's concern and couldn't help but feel a surge of joy. It was Na Lan's appearance that reignited his hope for life. Upon returning to Beijing, Gui Xian immediately called Na Lan. After hesitating for a moment, Na Lan reminded Gui Xian that if he still wanted to start a business and secure investment from their company, it would be best if their personal relationship remained confidential, as the company had strict disciplinary requirements. Gui Xian didn't care about that. At this stage, all he wanted was to see Na Lan. He claimed that he had brought Na Lan a gift from Tibet. Unexpectedly, while Gui Xian was waiting for Na Lan at the bar, he suddenly received the bad news that his brother had been beaten up and sent to the hospital. This forced him to leave. As Gui Xian ran out of the bar, he glanced back. He didn't know that he had just seen Na Lan in the crowd. Na Lan also saw him when she turned around. The two locked eyes but missed each other because they didn't recognize each other. After handling his affairs, Gui Xian immediately called Na Lan. He promised to go to the investment company the next day to apologize in person. This led to a dramatic turn of events. The next day, while Na Lan was in a meeting, her secretary suddenly walked in and said there was a Mr. Guo waiting for her at the door. Na Lan felt a little happy and asked her secretary to tell Gui Xian to wait for her in her office. However, before she could finish speaking, Gui Xian suddenly appeared at the door of the conference room. He even knocked on the glass door, attracting the attention of several people. He had always thought that the assistant Wen Di was the Na Lan who had called him, so he deliberately made a gesture for Wen Di to leave. Na Lan was just about to get up and leave when Gui Xian suddenly waved his hand to indicate that it was not her. Then he pointed at Wen Di through the glass with his hand. Wen Di saw this and looked completely confused. Na Lan had no choice but to sit back down in disappointment, because Wen Di had to receive dozens of entrepreneurs every day. She had long forgotten that she had received Gui Xian before. Gui Xian then explained the reason for his failure to show up last night, and enthusiastically took out the gift he had brought back for Wen Di from Tibet. During this time, Na Lan kept glancing outside, because she still didn't understand what was going on. Gui Xian, who was completely unaware of this, handed Wen Di his project proposal, and asked her to give him her valuable opinions, until Wen Di said impatiently that she had to go to a meeting. Gui Xian finally turned around with a smile on his face and left. Wen Di looked at the project proposal in her hand and was completely confused. She then threw it and the gift into the trash can with disgust. The entire scene was witnessed by Na Lan. At first, Wen Di thought Gui Xian was just someone who used gifts to get ahead. It wasn't until after the meeting that she finally realized what had happened. Wen Di explained the whole situation. All the misunderstandings stemmed from the wrong business card. Na Lan couldn't help but laugh and cry at the same time. It turned out that Gui Xian had always mistaken her for Wen Di. She also decided to keep this beautiful misunderstanding a secret. So, just before leaving work, Na Lan returned to pick up the items she had thrown away, because only she knew that this proposal was Gui Xian's only chance to turn his life around. But just as she was about to take the proposal back to analyze it, her ex-boyfriend Jin Fei suddenly tricked her into coming to his house. Na Lan kicked him straight into the pool, recalling all the dirty things he had done in the past, plus his lack of ambition. Na Lan couldn't hold back any longer and broke up with him, but Jin Fei believed that his family had plenty of money, although they had been together for 8 years. Na Lan was determined not to compromise anymore. She looked down on men who lacked ambition from the bottom of her heart. Unexpectedly, when she left, she accidentally left Gui Xian's project proposal on the sofa. Jin Fei was unwilling to lose Na Lan so easily and decided to achieve something to prove himself. Just as he was unsure what project to take on, he accidentally discovered the proposal Na Lan had left behind. He curiously opened the file folder and after looking through it for a while, an excited expression appeared on his face. He immediately called Butler Wu, who was staying with his father. and told him about it. Jin Fei even pretended to send the information to the board of directors of the Hong Kong company. He believed that mobile internet software was definitely the most promising business field in the future. He even wanted to cooperate with the largest domestic telecommunications operator. Jin Fei asked Butler Wu to help him arrange a meeting with the bosses of several major operators for the next day. At the same time, Gua Xian called Nalan to ask if her report had any prospects. Nalan suddenly remembered that she had left the report at Jin Fei's house. At first, she realized the seriousness of the situation, but then she thought that a playboy like Jin Fei wouldn't care even if he saw it. So, at first, neither of them took the matter seriously. However, they never expected that Jin Fei would establish his own company in just a few days by cooperating with several major operators. He renamed Gua Xian's project Jieshuan. At the same time, he invited his father from Hong Kong so that he could visit the company and invest in it. However, Jin Xinghua said that Jin Fei had to finance the research and development himself. At this moment, he remembered that Na Lan was the manager of an investment company. With her support, the funding problem would be solved. Jin Fei said that he hadn't seen Na Lan recently. Jin Xinghua reminded his son that Na Lan's investment company was the industry leader, and that a project matching conference would be held next month. At first, Jin Fei didn't take it seriously, but a few days later, the engineer said that it would take another 6 months to develop a prototype. His words completely enraged Jin Fei. As expected, the engineer was beaten to a pulp and lying on the ground. The more arrogant he had been a moment ago, the more miserable he was now. Jin Fei then handed him 150,000 yuan and demanded he complete the software within a month. If completed successfully, he would be rewarded an additional 500,000 yuan in one go. It was precisely this brutal management style that drove his company's rapid growth. Gua Xian was driving while playing with his phone and nearly hit a traffic police officer on duty by the roadside. But before he could apologize, he was rear-ended by a female driver behind him. The cause of the collision was also driving while sending messages. The traffic police educated both of them, emphasizing that driving while using a phone was absolutely prohibited, as taking your eyes off the road for even a moment was extremely dangerous. However, the traffic police's simple words suddenly sparked an idea in Gua Xian, who was just about to start his own business. He thought that creating a voice-activated app for phones could solve the problem of people using their phones while driving. The traffic police looked at him as if he were crazy, but what he didn't know was that Gua Xian's idea was worth far more than 100 billion, and it was that very collision with the female driver that completely changed Gua Xian's fate. Soon, Gua Xian found two friends he had once started a business with. One was a programmer dubbed a genius, Lu Ka. The other was an accountant skilled in mathematics, Yang Li. The advantage of this was that the other person could not only hear what you said, but also sense your tone and emotions. Most importantly, it could replace typing and save time. However, Lu Ka dismissed his idea as unremarkable. After all, making a phone call could achieve the three advantages he mentioned. Gua Xian argued that people nowadays love to text while driving. With this voice software, everyone could completely free their hands and eyes from the keyboard. This could very well be a new form of communication for humanity. Gua Xian's passionate speech successfully piqued Lu Ka's interest. He immediately decided to quit his job and follow Gua Xian. Yang Li believed that Gua Xian only had a simple concept. He knew nothing about the future plans or market prospects. However, she didn't know that Gua Xian had already prepared everything. He took out the design drawings for the voice software and enthusiastically talked about his design concepts and ideas. He planned to design the software as a green square box. When opened, a contact list would appear. To talk to someone, just click on their name and speak directly. Gua Xian believed that this software was magical, so he named it Magic. Encouraged by Gua Xian, the three of them were passionate and ready to work hard. But as the saying goes, every great dream needs financial support. To this end, Gua Xian immediately found his good friend Luo Wei. After sharing this great idea with him, he hoped that Luo Wei could lend him 600,000 yuan. However, as luck would have it, Luo Wei was also starting a business recently, so he didn't have any extra money. That night, Gua Xian, Lu Ka, and Yang Li had a barbecue together. When the topic of money came up, everyone frowned. Yang Li was even more discouraged. After a rough calculation, she estimated that they would need at least 1.5 million yuan to get started. Gua Xian only had a few 100,000 yuan. Lu Ka had just graduated and had no money at all. As for Yang Li, there was no need to mention her financial situation. Just then, Gua Xian spoke confidently about his trip to Tibet. It made him realize that life is only once, and that not realizing one's dreams is the biggest failure. Hearing this, the other two were infected by his enthusiasm. A few days later, Yang Li brought Gui Xian some good news. Her mother had prepared 500,000 yuan for her wedding. She decided to have a fake wedding with Lu Ka. Gui Xian was completely baffled. He even suspected that the two of them already had a child. Yang Li's plan was to first tell her mother about the wedding and then use the 500,000 yuan. She believed that with Gui Xian's abilities, the project was sure to succeed. It seemed like this was the only option available at the moment. So Yang Li took Lu Ka home to meet her parents. However, as a programmer, Lu Ka had never experienced such a situation before. Not only that, but he suddenly knelt down on the ground. With a wise expression, he pleaded with Yang Li's mother to marry her daughter to him. Lu Ka's bizarre behavior left the mother and daughter speechless. When he answered questions later, he made numerous mistakes. This was because the questions Yang Li's mother asked were completely different from what they had rehearsed before. Lu Ka had no choice but to improvise. When it was time to eat, Linda pointed out many of her daughter's character flaws. However, Lu Ka looked at Yang Li affectionately and listed her virtues as if they were his own. Yang Li was stunned. She never imagined that Lu Ka had such a good impression of her. What if the fake relationship became real? Linda then asked Lu Ka to stay the night. Although Yang Li was deeply repelled by the idea, she had no choice but to compromise in order to get the money sooner. Fortunately, the next morning, her mother finally handed over her life savings to Yang Li. She felt that although Lu Ka was a bit clumsy, he was still a decent person. Yang Li felt a pang of guilt upon hearing this. But her mother was understanding and told her to take the money and start a business with Lu Ka. With the money in hand, the three entrepreneurs happily went to the supermarket to go on a shopping spree. They then went to Yang Li's room to raise their glasses and drink together. The three of them drank all night long. However, the next morning, Lindy suddenly came to her daughter's room. To her shock, she saw a stranger lying in Yang Li's bed. This left her completely at a loss about how to face Lu Ka in the future. Lu Ka, seeing the situation, hurriedly woke Yang Li up. Then he immediately woke up Gui Xian, who was sleeping like a log. Yang Li immediately explained to her mother that the man on the bed was her boss. At this point, Lu Ka began to argue that there were originally 3 people sleeping on the bed, but later found that it was too crowded. So he went to sleep in the bathtub by himself. The 3 of them explained themselves in a flurry of words, but in the end, they were still unable to withstand Linda's anger. Due to Gui Xian's lack of startup capital for his business, he could only bring his team to a coffee shop to use the Wi-Fi every day. The 3 of them would order 1 cup of coffee and sit there all day. However, their behavior soon caught the attention of the shop owner. The owner didn't expose them, but there was one thing that piqued her curiosity. She noticed that Gui Xian would take sips of his coffee throughout the morning, yet his cup was still full. The boss smiled and shrugged it off. But it was this cup of coffee that brought the fates of these people together. In the days that followed, the boss often ran into them, and after a few simple exchanges, she gradually became interested in the 3 young people. So she gathered them all together and told them that she had seen countless young entrepreneurs in her coffee shop, but this was the first time she had seen anyone as confident as them. So the boss wanted to know if they had found any investors yet. She also enthusiastically asked about the status of their business plan. After a thorough understanding, the boss quickly found a professional angel investor for them. Gaudi sat down and analyzed their project professionally. Currently, Gui Xian wanted to develop a voice software app for mobile phones. Although the idea was perfect, there were also many issues at the moment. First, what was the profit model for this software? Second, how long would it take to develop a sample of the software? However, Gui Xian said that with the 2 of them, that was enough. He reached out and invited them to be his angel investors. Unexpectedly, after much hesitation, Gao Di decisively refused. He believed that Gui Xian had not given him a reason that could convince him. Gui Xian said that God had 2 apples, one of which fell on Newton's head. He immediately thought of gravity. The other apple fell on Steve Jobs' head, and he immediately decided to develop the Apple computer. This idea was a genius concept worth dedicating one's entire life to. Gui Xian was confident that the 2 would invest in his project. Gao Di and his boss Su Jia did not disappoint him. Gao Mo Coffee decided to invest 2 million in cash for a 20% stake in the company. Gui Xian appeared calm on the surface but was overjoyed inside. So when Yang Li handed him the pen, he turned around without hesitation to sign the contract. Su Jia suddenly stopped him because there was still a mutual agreement between the 2 parties. The agreement required Gui Xian to complete the product prototype within a month. However, Lu Ka believed this was impossible to achieve. Even Gui Xian felt the conditions were too stringent, but Gao Di argued that mobile application software was evolving rapidly. If someone else beat them to it, the 2 million investment would go down the drain. Gui Xian signed the contract with a bold stroke of his pen. The group then raised their glasses in celebration, acknowledging how difficult the journey had been. Gui Xian was most grateful to Nalan for her help. He shared the good news with her. Nalan immediately shared the news with Wendy. On the surface, the two seemed like close friends, but each had their own agenda. Because there was another company participating in the project meeting, and the founder of that company, Luo Wei, was Wendy's secret boyfriend of 8 years. Therefore, she would do anything to stop Nalan from helping Gui Xian. Luo Wei had once declared his ambition to become the world's richest man, only to be ruthlessly fired by his boss. The boss even demanded that he strip off his company uniform on the spot. Unable to tolerate this, Luo Wei snatched off the boss's wig. The boss gave him a meaningful look. With no other choice, Luo Wei reluctantly pulled down his pants, revealing his red, sexy briefs. Not only that, but as he left, he even mocked his boss one last time. Perhaps this is the last bit of stubbornness of a worker. But for Luo Wei, this choice completely changed the course of his life. Soon, Luo Wei developed a software called Lone Wolf and confidently founded his company. As the saying goes, every successful company needs a boss who can talk big. To that end, Luo Wei began promising his employees that the company would soon launch a series of funding round for a world-class company. By the time they reached the Series B funding round, the company would go public, and everyone present would be original shareholders. At that point, each person's net worth would be no less than 1.5 billion yuan. It must be said that Luo Wei's speech was indeed very inspiring. However, while ideals are lofty, reality is always cruel. Soon after the company began operations, Luo Wei found himself in a predicament, because chat apps like theirs were already everywhere, so the development process was extremely challenging. But fortunately, Luo Wei had a sudden inspiration: add additional features to the app. Besides basic chat and email functionality, users could also play games, book tickets, order takeout, and more. The company's employees all thought this was a pipe dream, but Luo Wei believed that as long as there was a dream, it could be achieved. However, as the saying goes, every dream requires financial support. Due to severe cash flow shortages, the company was at risk of bankruptcy at any moment. The only solution was to secure investment from Luofei. However, there was a glimmer of hope. Luofei was about to host a project matching event. It turned out that Gui Xian, Luo Wei's close friend, was also participating in the event. Luo Wei had no confidence in securing the investment. Fortunately, Luo Wei's girlfriend, Wendy, happened to be an assistant in Luofei's investment department. Since General Manager Nalan and Gui Xian are close friends, she naturally wants to support Gui Xian's company in this event. After the meeting, Wendy immediately shared Luofei's internal information with Luo Wei. Upon receiving the information, Luo Wei hurriedly revised their project proposal. On the day of the event, Luo Wei happened to run into Wendy at Luofei's. However, after exchanging glances, they pretended not to recognize each other and went their separate ways, just as Wendy had expected. After Luo Wei introduced the software developed by his company to Luofei's, he immediately won unanimous applause from everyone. At this moment, it seemed that Luo Wei had already won the game. In fact, things quickly took a turn. When Nalan saw Jin Fei's proposal that day, she finally realized that she had made a big mistake. The content of the proposal was exactly the same as that of her friends. Due to the urgency of the situation, Nalan immediately decided to find Gui Xian to apologize in person and explain everything. However, just as the car was halfway there, she received a call from the president. Since an investment meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, the president demanded that she return to the company within 10 minutes. Thus, Nalan once again delayed the matter, and the target of this meeting was none other than Jin Fei, who had founded a new company by plagiarizing someone else's work. In the meeting room, Jin Fei casually promoted the product to the investment company. After going through the entire process, the president and others were very satisfied. Only Nalan, with a gloomy expression, asked him where the inspiration for the company came from. Faced with the question, he said that whether or not to invest in Luofei would depend on Nalan's attitude. As soon as the meeting ended, Nalan chased him all the way to the company building and confronted Jin Fei again. Although Jin Fei directly admitted that he was not the original creator of the project, he shamelessly claimed that it was a gift from heaven. Due to his emotional state, Nalan decided to approach the president and reveal the truth. However, The president believed that Na Lan's special relationship with Jean Fei might influence his judgment. He even instructed Na Lan not to participate in the project. With no other option, Na Lan had to humbly approach Jean Fei to plead for mercy. She said that her friend Gui Xian valued this project more than his own life and hoped that Jean Fei would give up the project. Unexpectedly, Jean Fei said that he had no interest in starting a business and that he could easily give up the project. However, there was one condition: Na Lan must marry him immediately. He even said that he would ask his father to pay 2 billion yuan as a dowry. Of course, Na Lan was unwilling to marry him. She had come this time to give Jean Fei a chance to make amends. Soon, Gui Xian learned about the project being plagiarized. He stormed out angrily and confronted Na Lan, demanding to know who had done it. Na Lan felt guilty and admitted it was all her fault. She had accidentally left the proposal at Jean Fei's house. She never expected this lazy playboy to plagiarize the proposal. Gui Xian recounted the arduous process of establishing the project. Na Lan listened the entire time, but to be honest, her expression was too calm. I couldn't detect a single trace of guilt in her. Na Lan then stated that if Gui Xian wanted to sue Jean Fei, she would not hesitate to testify on his behalf. To everyone's surprise, Gui Xian became extremely emotional upon hearing this, as he had been embroiled in a divorce lawsuit for 2.5 years. Even if he were to win the lawsuit against Jean Fei now, what would that accomplish? After securing the initial funding, Gui Xian quickly led his team in developing the software. Although this voice-activated software is now familiar to many, it was a groundbreaking invention a decade ago. All one needs to do is press the voice button, speak into the phone, and release the button. The words he just spoke would be transmitted in voice form to another device. Although the voice software had been developed, to successfully launch it, they must obtain investment from Luofei. Fortunately, he had a friend named Na Lan, who was the general manager of Luofei Company. For this reason, Gui Xian sent the project proposal to Na Lan. However, after reviewing it, Na Lan felt that the 100-page PowerPoint presentation was too lengthy. After all, Luofei Company was not an internet lecture hall, so they must focus on the key points. They needed to clearly explain what the unique features and advantages of this software were. Gui Xian was moved by this and decided to condense the proposal into 3 pages. However, his idea was immediately opposed by Yang Li. The reason was that she had spent 3 months writing the 100-page proposal. For a time, the team was divided, so they had no choice but to vote. But it was clear that Gui Xian would win in the end. Soon, the day of the project meeting arrived. Originally, Lofis only gave them half an hour. However, Gui Xian was already 15 minutes late. With no other choice, he decided to take a bold move and suddenly asked the employees present if they all had cars. He then invited Wendy to come up and help him simulate a scene of driving. For example, suppose you have to go to a very important meeting, but unfortunately, you encounter traffic on the way. Since it was urgent, you need to send a text message to your boss to inform him that you will be half an hour late. Obviously, Wendy took his eyes off the road for a full 20 seconds while sending the message. Moreover, in those 20 seconds, he only typed 5 words. For a moment, everyone fell into deep thought. Next, Gui Xian invited Na Lan to the stage to simulate the same scenario. However, this time, instead of editing a text message, she was asked to open the voice software her team had just developed. Following Gui Xian's instructions, Na Lan spoke the 5 words Wendy had just typed. Soon, Gui Xian's phone received a voice message. He then played the voice message for everyone to hear. Gui Xian's on-site demonstration successfully piqued President Peng's strong interest. However, that wasn't all. This software not only freed people's hands and eyes from the keyboard, but also allowed the other party to feel your tone and emotions through voice format. Unlike making a phone call, the voice software didn't require an immediate response. This gave you ample time to think and organize what you wanted to say. If this software could be successfully launched, it might very well become a new form of communication for humanity. As soon as he finished speaking, the room erupted in thunderous applause. If everything goes as planned, he will soon secure funding from Luofei's company. However, things didn't turn out as smoothly as expected. His close friend Luo Wei, who was competing with him, resorted to underhanded tactics to secure the funding. Upon learning this, Wendy didn't get angry but instead acted as if nothing had happened. This was because she and her boyfriend had deliberately set up a trap. Luo Wei quickly asked Na Lan out on a date. Sitting in the cable car, the two looked like a couple. His goal was to get his project funded by Lofis. But as the manager of Lofis, Na Lan was no fool. She got straight to the point. Na Lan's casual joke was misunderstood by Luo Wei, so when he dropped her off at her door, he kissed her. Watching Na Lan's departing figure, Luo Wei gradually fell into deep thought. Little did he know that Wendy suddenly rushed out and forcibly pulled Luo Wei into the car. Fearing that Luo Wei and Na Lan might take their act too far, Wendy angrily demanded to know what he had done today, but Luo Wei claimed that he had done it all for their future. He said that Wendy had even sold his house to support him in starting his business. Without Wendy, he wouldn't have his company today. Luo Wei promised that because of this, he would never love another woman for the rest of his life. Wendy was completely swept away by his sweet words and couldn't resist. But who would have thought that after a night of passion, Wendy suddenly came to her senses again? She still couldn't trust that Luo Wei would keep his word. Luo Wei didn't swear, but said he did it all for Wendy. Unexpectedly, Wendy believed him again. In fact, this would be her most regrettable choice. The next day, in the office of Luofei Company, Na Lan questioned Wendy about whether she had kept it from her and reported Luo Wei's company project to the president without permission, although Wendy refused to admit it. Ma Ding, who was standing nearby, said that only Wendy had taken over Luo Wei's company's weekly report. Wendy again denied that she was helping Luo Wei. Soon after, Na Lan deliberately told Wendy that Luo Wei was pursuing her. Sure enough, Wendy lost control of her emotions and stood frozen in place for 10 seconds. She questioned the two of them about whether they had been playing games together. Na Lan said that she had met with Luo Wei to find out who had leaked the company information. She had already discovered that there was a mole within the company but had no concrete evidence. So the next day, she deliberately sought out Wendy's friend. She also managed to find out through subtle questioning that Wendy was not single. Since that was the case, Na Lan decided to use the excuse of buying a fitness class to ask the coach for a photo of Wendy's boyfriend. The coach then waited downstairs at the company every day. Coincidentally, Luo Wei came to find Na Lan for a date at that moment. The coach saw this and immediately took a photo and sent it to Na Lan. Na Lan learned that Wendy and Luo Wei were in a relationship but did not make the matter explicit. When Luo Wei dropped Na Lan off at her door, he suddenly received a call from Wendy. Seeing that everything had been exposed, Luo Wei no longer held back and offered Na Lan an olive branch. He even shamelessly offered Na Lan his future. But Na Lan asked him what he would do to Wendy. Luo Wei replied, "I think you're more important to me than Wendy." He meant it because money was more important to him than anything else. But he didn't expect that Na Lan had recorded his entire conversation with a voice recorder. Na Lan warned him that if he dared to pull any more tricks, she would hand the voice recorder over to Wendy. This time, Luo Wei lost completely. Na Lan originally planned to report Wendy's behavior to the company, but to her surprise, Wendy began to cry and complain. She had been dating Luo Wei in hopes of achieving success in the future. However, Na Lan knew exactly what kind of person Luo Wei was. She knew that Wendy would eventually suffer, so she decided not to pursue the matter further. But the open and covert struggles between the three continued. On this day, Jin Fei publicly plagiarized someone else's idea, which completely angered the original creator in the audience. Gui Xian was so angry because Jin Fei not only plagiarized his project, but also sent people to destroy his research and development results. So, in order to get revenge, Gui Xian asked the reporters to point their cameras at himself. He mocked Jin Fei in front of the camera, calling him a thief. Gui Xian finished speaking and turned away with a smirk. But Jin Fei didn't take this poor young man seriously. This would be the decision he would regret the most. Back at the RD base, Gui Xian's two partners were watching the press conference. But when they saw that the features and interface of Jie Sun were identical to those of Magic, Gao Di couldn't help but curse. As the two continued to complain, Gui Xian's voice suddenly came from behind them. He asked his partners if they could make something that couldn't be plagiarized. Gui Xian immediately expressed his new idea to the two of them. That was to add a group function to Magic and create a space like a conference room. That would allow multiple people to join and talk at the same time. During this time, they could freely combine and separate, and even name the space. This was actually a mobile internet chat software. Su Jia and Gao Di were stunned upon hearing this. They not only praised Gui Xian as a genius, but also readily agreed to invest another 5 million yuan in research and development funds. Gui Xian immediately shared this good news with Lu Ka. However, he was too happy too soon, because he shared this idea with a big shot in the investment industry. The news quickly reached Jin Fei's ears. Despite everyone's repeated pleas, Gui Xian insisted on meeting Jin Fei. He believed it was time to settle things once and for all with Jin Fei. Soon, the two met in an abandoned warehouse. As soon as they arrived, Jin Fei threw two heavy briefcases onto the ground. Under Gui Xian's puzzled gaze, the briefcases were slowly opened. $2 million in cash suddenly appeared before his eyes. Jin Fei wanted to buy out Gui Xian's company's technology outright. letting him split the money with the shareholders. He was also willing to give Gui Xian a personal stake in his company. However, Gui Xian remained unmoved by his offer. Jin Fei began to threaten Gui Xian, saying that last time he sent people to crash into the RD base, but next time they might crash into him. The partners were relieved to see Gui Xian come out unharmed. However, in order to learn from the lessons of the previous two failures and avoid Jin Fei's threats, the partners specially found a secret base for the team. In the days that followed, the team would complete the software development there. To prevent any leaks, Su Jia also asked everyone to hand over their phones until the software was successfully developed. Since the investment meeting was about to begin in a few days, they had to upload the software to the mobile app store in advance. Day after day, they worked tirelessly, eating only when necessary. Fortunately, their hard work paid off, and the team successfully developed the new software. The next morning, everyone stayed in bed, unwilling to get up, because they dared not face the results of their hard work. Only Gui Xian woke up early. He sat down at the computer, took a sip of water, and opened the pages of two mobile app stores. To his surprise, he discovered that Magic had become the top recommendation on the software stores chart. Everyone was moved to tears. This moment had been too long in coming. Gui Xian then led his team, dressed in their best attire, to the investment company. This time, he was competing against two other companies. One was his so-called brother, Luo Wei, and the other was Jin Fei, a wealthy second-generation heir who had plagiarized Gui Xian's idea. In terms of funding and personnel, both of them were clearly superior. Therefore, no one took this poor young man seriously. However, what no one could have anticipated was that Gui Xian would soon prove them all wrong. Soon, the project presentation meeting officially began. 3 voice software companies participated in the bidding. Besides the 5-minute presentation, the most important factor was the download volume of their software after it was launched. The winning company would receive a huge investment from Luffy's company. The first to speak was the wealthy second-generation Jin Fei. As soon as he took the stage, he began to vigorously promote the advantages of Jiexuan. He stated that for every voice message sent by customers using Jiexuan, he would charge 1 yuan. When an analyst questioned Jin Fei's unreasonable pricing, he immediately countered by accusing the analyst of being disrespectful. Someone else then argued that Jiexuan software was unlikely to become a necessity in daily life. However, Jin Fei arrogantly stated that he had bundled the software with mobile phones, and that as of now, 7 million mobile phones already contained Jiexuan software. For this reason, Jin Fei confidently assured everyone that, if he could obtain financing from Luffy's, his company would soon be listed on the stock market. After a round of applause, the second speaker was Luo Wei, who had also plagiarized Gui Xian. In addition to voice functions, Luo Wei's Lone Wolf software added many lifestyle services, such as ordering takeout, booking tickets, checking the weather, and other functions. However, these were just a fig leaf to cover up his plagiarism. Gao Di couldn't help but sigh in the audience, thinking how unfortunate Gui Xian was to have such friends. Luo Wei then presented data showing that his software had been downloaded 1 million times in 2 weeks, proving that it was indeed very powerful. As expected, President Pang was highly optimistic about the future after reviewing the data. Finally, it was Gui Xian's turn to speak on behalf of Magic Software. However, Gui Xian was furious at the two plagiarists and appeared extremely uncomfortable. After all, in the face of two powerful rivals, his Magic Software had almost no chance of winning. Upon hearing this, his partners immediately lost their composure. Even others couldn't believe that Gui Xian, the genius speaker, was so quiet today. President Pang also noticed his negative attitude and asked him about the download numbers for Magic Software. To everyone's surprise, the download count for the Magic Software, which had only been available for 1 day, had astonishingly reached over 6 million. Everyone was deeply shocked, and they all stood up unconsciously, staring blankly at the large screen. At first, Gui Xian didn't realize it, but when he turned his head and saw the download count, he was so stunned he couldn't speak. Everyone realized that the Magic Software had created a nearly mythical legend. Gui Xian was triumphant in his career, but he would soon face setbacks in his love life. He continued to call the number on the business card every day, just as he had before. What was even more bizarre was that the two of them, out of nowhere, developed feelings for each other. During their online relationship, Na Lan, who was the investment manager, continued to help Gui Xian with his startup. At the same time, the two of them made a promise that once their startup succeeded, they would marry and live together. Soon, with Na Lan's help, Gui Xian successfully secured a large investment from Luofei's company. On the agreed day, Gui Xian called Na Lan several times, but no one answered. However, Na Lan had accidentally left her phone at home due to an urgent matter. With no other option, Gui Xian went to the investment company to look for her. Just then, he happened to see Wendy going upstairs. At that moment, Gui Xian still mistook Wendy for Na Lan. He secretly followed Wendy to her residence. Upon meeting her, Wendy was initially at a loss. However, she gradually realized that Gui Xian had mistaken her for Na Lan. During this time, she went through a long internal struggle. At first, Wendy felt some resistance, as they had never developed any feelings for each other. But on the other hand, this man she had once looked down upon was now worth over 100 million. This caused the money-loving Wendy to gradually lose herself. At the same time, Na Lan saw the confession Gui Xian sent her. After reading it, Na Lan smiled and called Gui Xian. Gui Xian, who was still half asleep, answered the phone. He didn't expect Wendy to suddenly speak up. Na Lan immediately hung up the phone. At that moment, her view of love completely collapsed. The next morning, Gui Xian woke up and got what he wanted. Smiling foolishly, he even decided to give 5% of his company's shares to Wendy. He had always thought that it was Wendy who had been helping him behind the scenes. Wendy looked at Gui Xian with mixed feelings. He knew that he had mistaken him for someone else, but he didn't say anything. After all, several million shares was a considerable temptation. Soon after, Wendy returned to the company with a happy smile and bluntly asked Na Lan if she loved Gui Xian. Na Lan was momentarily confused, hesitated for a moment, and then said that the two of them were impossible. Wendy smiled triumphantly upon hearing this and immediately revealed everything that had happened the previous night. Everything that was supposed to happen between her and Gui Xian had already happened. Wendy calmly said that breaking up would take a long time to heal, but falling in love with Gui Xian only took a minute. Na Lan stared at Wendy in disbelief. Just then, her phone rang. Wendy snatched the phone from her hand. Na Lan, furious, turned and walked away without looking back. When Wendy chased after her, she angrily pushed her hand away. She then accused Wendy of being a despicable person. When she heard that Wendy had accepted 5% of Gui Xian's shares, Na Lan was even more furious and slapped her across the face. But Wendy didn't get angry. Instead, she smiled contentedly, because she believed that this way, the two of them were even. Still furious, Na Lan stormed off, but the misunderstandings between the two were far from over. But it was all worth it to Wendy. She thought she would soon have a wonderful life. In fact, her lie was about to be exposed. That day, Gui Xian came to the investment company as a partner. President Peng introduced him to everyone present. The most important people were the two powerful figures beside him. When Na Lan's name was mentioned, Gui Xian froze. He looked at Wendy with confusion. Wendy avoided his gaze with an unnatural expression. For a moment, Gui Xian was lost in thought. He recalled the entire process of how he met Wendy and felt that something was very strange about this matter. Gradually coming to his senses, Gui Xian stared intently at Na Lan. Na Lan had no choice but to leave the conference room under the pretext of an excuse. Seeing this, Gui Xian immediately followed him. The two of them stood face to face in the hallway. Na Lan spoke first, saying that her name was Na Lan. Upon hearing this, tears instantly welled up in Gui Xian's eyes. He wanted to explain something, but he didn't know how to start. With a heavy heart, Na Lan silently walked past Gui Xian. After returning home, Gui Xian looked at his chat history with Na Lan. He recalled the entire process of Na Lan helping him start his business. His heart was filled with endless self-blame and guilt. Just then, Wendy sensed the situation and pulled her suitcase over to Gui Xian. She said that she would return the 5% share to him. However, Gui Xian didn't care about that small share. He sincerely hoped that Wendy would tell him the truth. Gui Xian had always thought that Wendy was Na Lan's English name. After learning the truth, he slapped himself several times. Seeing this, Wendy immediately played the emotional card, saying that she had just broken up with her ex-boyfriend that day and was desperate to find someone to love. Coincidentally, just at that moment, Gui Xian suddenly came to find her and said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. Greedy for that promise, she lost herself. After saying that, Wendy turned and left without looking back. Unexpectedly, Gui Xian suddenly called her back and said that he was the one who should apologize. Even more outrageous was that Gui Xian begged Wendy to stay and forget everything that had happened before so that they could start over. After hesitating for a moment, he hugged Wendy in his arms. But as the saying goes, fake things are still fake. After all, Na Lan was the only emotional anchor in Gui Xian's life and entrepreneurial journey. Wendy also quickly revealed her true colors. At the annual internet conference, Gui Xian launched his newly released voice software. Magic. Also on stage with him were his competitor Jean Fei and two telecommunications companies that had partnered with Jean Fei. At the beginning of the press conference, Gui Xian showed the audience the powerful features of Magic and promised that users could send an unlimited number of voice messages for free on his software. However, Jean Fei was not convinced and questioned why Magic should be free. After all, Magic was using the network resources of the operators. Jean Fei's words sparked controversy among the audience. No one wanted to pay for something that was free. The reason Jean Fei was so eager to discredit Magic was because his own voice software required payment. In order to survive, he had to defeat the free Magic software in front of everyone. Gui Xian compared the relationship between Magic software and telecom operators to the steam engine replacing horse-drawn carriages in the past. He believed that Magic software's free model was also an innovation. Although it consumes a large amount of network traffic during this period, it does not mean they do not pay for server costs. If Magic software is a thief, then all internet software should be thieves. However, telecom operators stated that telecommunications services are part of national infrastructure and must have a national license. Magic Software's model violates this regulation. Gui Xian laughed because he had never heard of needing a license to develop software. He argued that even when using servers reasonably, he still had to pay operators for their public systems. As soon as Jean Fei finished speaking, the entire internet community erupted. Some supported Jean Fei, while others supported Gui Xian. At that moment, the industry veteran Li Benti stepped forward to defend Gui Xian. He argued that with the rapid development of the internet, telecom operators' basic communication services would inevitably be phased out. However, Jean Fei remained unconvinced and continued to accuse Magic Software of wasting public infrastructure. Just as the debate reached a stalemate, Na Lan suddenly stood up. Her appearance made the entire scene extremely tense. Na Lan pointed out that public assets belong to the people, not a business, and certainly not the private property of certain interest groups. Her words left Jean Fei speechless, and the audience erupted in thunderous applause. However, even so, Luo Wei did not hold much hope for Gui Xian. He told Wendy a story about an old wolf and a lamb to imply that Gui Xian had done nothing wrong. But this could not stop the operators' attacks and also implied that Magic Software was no match for the operators. After the press conference, Gui Xian expressed his gratitude to Na Lan. Although Na Lan claimed it was for the sake of the company's investment safety, her heart remained with Gui Xian. After experiencing this fierce internet war, Gui Xian was immersed in a beautiful future and couldn't pull himself out of it. Luo Wei accidentally discovered that his ex-girlfriend was hugging his best friend. So Luo Wei suppressed the anger in his heart and called Gui Xian aside to ask him what his relationship with Wendy was. Gui Xian immediately said that he and Wendy were just friends. Upon hearing this, Luo Wei immediately punched Gui Xian in the face. Gui Xian, disregarding others' attempts to stop him, charged forward and retaliated against Luo Wei. Thus, the two former close friends who had once fought together ended up in a heated altercation at the National Internet Conference in front of everyone. Although they were eventually separated, due to the severe impact of the incident, they were taken to the police station. Luo Wei asked Gui Xian again when he had started dating Wendy. Gui Xian replied that it was on the day he achieved success in his business. Luo Wei was stunned upon hearing this, as it was on that very day that he and Wendy had broken up. He then revealed that he and Wendy had been living together for 2 years. Gui Xian couldn't believe it, as he had never seen Wendy when he stayed at Luo Wei's house. As an entrepreneur, Luo Wei needed to avoid any appearance of impropriety with investors. Therefore, he and Wendy had been in a secret relationship for the past 2 years. At the same time, he was curious about why Gui Xian, who didn't know Wendy, had suddenly started dating her. Gui Xian explained that he had mistaken Wendy for Na Lan. Upon learning the truth, Luo Wei had no reason to blame Gui Xian. Gui Xian also accepted Luo Wei's punch without resentment. Since the misunderstanding had been cleared up, the two no longer held a grudge against each other. After all, Wendy was the one who started this conflict. If she hadn't deliberately concealed her identity, Gui Xian and Luo Wei wouldn't have ended up in such an awkward situation. Gui Xian's actions just now also made Wendy realize that Luo Wei had told him everything about them. So now she was thinking about how to explain it to Gui Xian. His friend was curious as to why the two brothers had suddenly gotten into a fight, but Luo Wei said that losing Wendy was the biggest mistake of his life. That night, when Gui Xian returned home, Wendy had specially prepared red wine. However, Gui Xian casually said that Luo Wei had already told him everything. He still felt sorry for Luo Wei in this matter, because Luo Wei had given everything to Wendy over the past 2 years. But when Luo Wei's business failed and he was at a low point in his life, Wendy abandoned him. Gua Xian said that he had been divorced, so he knew very well how painful it was for a man to suffer such a loss. He sarcastically implied that Wendy was a bad woman. Wendy retorted that she was the one who had been hurt the most throughout the whole process. Gua Xian then asked her why she didn't tell him about her relationship with Luo Wei when she knew about it. Wendy said that she was afraid of losing him, then got up and left. However, the complicated emotional entanglement between the two was far from over. After Gua Xian developed the voice software, he was quickly invited to the home of the big shot Li Benti. On the surface, he said he wanted to seek cooperation with Gua Xian, but in fact, he wanted to acquire the magic software. Wendy hurriedly reminded Gua Xian that the magic software needed a bigger platform. However, Gua Xian said that the internet was his platform. Faced with Li Benti's tempting offer, Gua Xian ignored him and talked eloquently instead. Finally, he concluded that he did not want to be acquired. In the past, Microsoft also wanted to acquire Steve Jobs, but Steve Jobs rejected Bill Gates. In the end, Li Benti left some room for Gua Xian to reconsider. He also said that his offer would be valid for a long time. At this moment, he knew very well that the arrogant Gua Xian would one day come begging him. Upon returning to Magic Company, Gua Xian found everyone staring at him with serious expressions. It wasn't until Wendy mentioned Li Benti that Gua Xian realized everyone was displeased with his refusal to accept the acquisition. At this point, Yao Di demanded a reason for his refusal. Gua Xian arrogantly declared that no one could be his competitor. Upon hearing this, the shareholders exchanged shocked glances, as no one in their right mind would make such a bold statement. Facing everyone's questioning looks, Gua Xian passionately described his business blueprint to everyone. He planned to develop magic software into a way of life. He believed that perhaps in the distant future, there would be no mobile phones in the world. Gua Xian's speech stirred everyone's emotions and won him enthusiastic applause from everyone present. But as the saying goes, ideals are lofty, but reality is always cruel. Soon after, the investment company behind the magic software received some bad news. The telecom operators were forcing the magic software to charge fees, which would quickly eliminate its advantage of being free to use. Therefore, the only hope now was for Gua Xian to agree to be acquired by another company. Only by aligning with the powerful platform of Qilin could the magic software have a chance to survive. The person Nalan was referring to was Wendy. After all, Wendy is currently Gua Xian's girlfriend. Perhaps Gua Xian might listen to her. However, Wendy said it was too difficult. She had just tried to persuade Gua Xian, but he didn't even acknowledge her. Nalan had no choice but to explain the severity of the situation. Yet Wendy was still arguing over emotional issues. On one hand, she held a 5% stake in magic software. On the other hand, she was receiving a monthly salary from the investment company. Nalan simply couldn't figure out whether she belonged to the magic company or the Luffy's company. If President Peng found out, she wouldn't know how to respond. Wendy told Nalan to just tell the truth when the time came. Anyone with eyes could see that Wendy wanted to resign. After all, this salary was worthless compared to the shares, so she confessed everything to President Peng and submitted her resignation. However, to President Peng's surprise, this matter also involved Nalan. Wendy took the initiative to admit that she had accepted 5% of the shares in magic software. Faced with President Peng's questioning look, she hurriedly explained that Gua Xian had given them to her voluntarily. After saying that, Wendy took out her resignation letter, which she had prepared in advance. After all, the salary here was insignificant compared to the shares. However, President Peng had no intention of letting her off the hook. With a grim expression, he asked her if anyone else knew about this. President Peng was stunned when he heard this, so he immediately called Nalan to his office to ask her what her relationship with Gua Xian was. Nalan explained to President Peng the whole story of how she had helped Gua Xian. At this point, President Peng was very puzzled. Since Nalan had helped Gua Xian start his business successfully, why would Gua Xian give his shares to Wendy? Nalan asked President Peng if she needed to resign, but President Peng angrily warned Nalan not to threaten him again. After all, the magic company they had invested in was in danger. So, in order to make up for the mistakes he had made, he ordered the two of them to do everything in their power to help the magic company through the crisis. First, as his girlfriend, Wendy took the lead, but at this point, the situation was far more complicated than she had imagined. Faced with a joint lawsuit from the operators, the shareholders all wanted to sell the magic company, which was on the verge of bankruptcy, but Gua Xian insisted on leading the magic company out of the crisis. Su Jia tried to persuade him that the company wasn't just his, and he couldn't approach the problem with such an attitude. Moreover, the magic company was currently facing a lawsuit, and if it was sealed by the court, everything would be lost. Even Wendy believed that Gui Xian should sell the magic company. At this point, Gui Xian had already gone mad. He treated magic company as his own child, so he couldn't let anyone sell it no matter what. However, given the current situation, Gao Di still persuaded him to be realistic. Seeing that the shareholders didn't understand him, Gui Xian was disheartened and made an appointment to meet with Nalan. Because on his path to entrepreneurship, Nalan was his only spiritual and emotional support. This was also the first time the two had met informally. Gui Xian was filled with embarrassment from head to toe. After all, Nalan was supposed to be his girlfriend, and the 5% stake should have belonged to her. So this time, he wanted to hear Na Lan's opinion. As Gui Xian had guessed, Na Lan was also strongly opposed to selling the magic company. The reason was that, given the current trend of the magic company's development, it had the potential to become a world-class software company. Moreover, it was still unclear whether Magic Company was guilty of illegal competition in the lawsuit. With Na Lan's support, Gui Xian was instantly filled with new hope, so he immediately returned to the company to reconvene the shareholders' meeting and apologize to everyone for his impulsive behavior. He explained that he did not consider Magic Company to be his own property. Gui Xian expressed the hardships and preciousness of their journey together, and also said that he respected everyone's decision. He said that whoever wanted to leave could do so. His sincere persuasion finally moved the shareholders. In the end, they all raised their hands to vote in favor of temporarily supporting Xian Nian's opinion. However, what the shareholders did not expect was that just as they were full of confidence and ready to face the difficulties, Magic Company suddenly received another devastating piece of news. Wendy went to visit her ex-boyfriend in the middle of the night, but as soon as she entered the door, she smelled a pungent odor. She never imagined that this once successful big boss would now be in such a desperate situation. She didn't want to stay there a moment longer, but Luo Wei suddenly called her back. He said that he had developed a new software program and that it wouldn't be long before he could make a comeback. He also hoped that she could give him some advice. Out of pity for him, Wendy stayed with mixed feelings. However, after reading it, she was shocked to discover that Luo Wei's software was exactly the same as Gui Xian's. Luo Wei didn't want to dwell on the issue of plagiarism, so he changed the subject and asked her how things were going with Gui Xian. Luo Wei tried to persuade Wendy, saying that Gui Xian would never love her. Wendy, however, revealed that Gui Xian had given her a 5% stake in the company. Upon hearing this, Luo Wei was speechless. What he never expected was that Wendy secretly copied a copy of his new software before leaving. After returning home, Wendy nestled in Gui Xian's arms like a little bird and confessed that she had met Luo Wei that day. She had a feeling that Luo Wei would sooner or later become Gui Xian's competitor. Wendy naively thought that Gui Xian was praising her, so she proudly took out a USB flash drive and said that she had secretly copied it from Luo Wei that day. Gui Xian opened it and found that Luo Wei was still copying his magic software. People like that will never succeed. But Wendy didn't think so. She said that Luo Wei's new software was very comprehensive, so they had to take it seriously. At that moment, Gui Xian never imagined that Wendy's actions would end up saving his life. The next day, when Gui Xian returned to the company, he heard the shareholders arguing fiercely. The reason was that after the Magic Company was sued by the operator, Apple Store had issued a notice requiring them to take down the app within 3 days. For a moment, Gui Xian remained silent, while Gao Di and Su Jiao were already arguing fiercely. After all, if the software was taken down, they would be finished. Just then, Wendy and Nalan also arrived at the Magic Company. They said that President Pang was negotiating with the Apple Store manager. The result of the negotiation was that the Magic Company must increase its download count by 10 million within 3 days. Otherwise, the Magic software would be taken down after 3 days. Ultimately, President Pang reluctantly reached an agreement with the manager. However, when it came to how to double the download count within 3 days, everyone present was at a loss. Meanwhile, all eyes turned to Gui Xian. Unless he could achieve a great technological breakthrough in a short time, there was no solution. After hesitating for a moment, Gui Xian showed everyone Luo Wei's new software. He explained that Luo Wei had added a social media feature to the voice chat functionality he had copied from the Magic software. Although he wasn't optimistic at first, after thinking about it carefully, he realized that it was indeed a very good idea. So now they had no choice but to go for broke. The shareholders were divided on whether to ask Luo Wei to come and help, and an argument ensued. Fortunately, in the end, everyone voted by a majority to approve it. Only the programmer Lu Ka strongly opposed it. Seeing that no one supported him, He left in anger and ran to the rooftop. There was a reason why he was so angry. No one would feel good if Luo Wei plagiarized the magic software that they had worked so hard to create. Guai Xian said that Luo Wei was Wendy's ex-boyfriend. Luo Wei suddenly lost his temper. Luo Wei had a fever of 100 degrees Celsius. But he still stayed in the basement every day to start his business. Seeing that his efforts had been fruitless, he planned to give up after finishing today's work. However, he never expected that a sudden phone call would completely change his fate. Luo Wei couldn't care less about his high fever and hurriedly pulled out the needle and left the hospital. The person who asked to meet him was none other than internet tycoon Li Benti. Because the largest voice software company in the industry was about to go bankrupt, he wanted to invite Luo Wei to join his design team to develop a new software to replace the magic software. Luo Wei hesitated after hearing this. He didn't understand why Li Benti would single him out. His friends were secretly delighted after hearing this. After all, everyone wanted to work for a big company. However, Luo Wei didn't think so. Since Li Benti was so eager to hire him, it meant that he must have some kind of value, so he said he needed a few days to think about it. Li Benti was playing mind games with Luo Wei. Just as the two were at an impasse in their negotiations, Luo Wei suddenly received another phone call. It was from Jin Fei, a rich second-generation entrepreneur. He claimed that he was preparing to develop a new software program and even sincerely invited Luo Wei to join him. Upon hearing this, Luo Wei instantly realized his own value, so he made up an excuse to brush it off. Then he walked back to the room with a confident stride. He then approached Li Benti with confidence and demanded 40% of the shares. Li Benti laughed upon hearing this. He looked at Luo Wei's defiant expression and admitted that the terms were too harsh. Just as their conversation reached a heated stage, Luo Wei received another phone call. It was Guai Xian, the founder of Magic Company. Because everyone was hoping that Magic Company would go bankrupt, he had no choice but to ask his good friend Luo Wei for help. As soon as the two met, Luo Wei made no secret of the fact that Li Benti had come to see him. Guai Xian said that if Luo Wei went to Li Benti's company, he would only be able to act as his dog at best. He got straight to the point and asked Luo Wei to help him save his company. The two were good friends who had gone through hardships together, so they immediately reached an understanding after communicating. Luo Wei then solemnly told Li Benti that he had made up his mind and was ready to go to Magic Company. The reason was simple. Although he and Guai Xian were competitors, they were both entrepreneurs and belonged to the same category of people. Li Benti, on the other hand, was an operator and the ruler of this world. After saying that, Luo Wei left without looking back. Then, led by Guai Xian, he arrived at the company, the place where he could fulfill his dreams. But as the saying goes, ideals are lofty, but reality is always cruel. After arriving at the company, Luo Wei learned that they had to increase the number of downloads by 10 million in 5 days. To this end, Luo Wei proposed to incorporate the ideas in his software into magic software. His idea was strongly opposed by programmer Lu Ka. Lu Ka believed that the original intention of magic was to be simple and pure. Guai Xian said that from now on, Luo Wei would be in charge of technical issues. Lu Ka was very dissatisfied and left in a huff. At this critical moment, the two programmers became enemies and neither was willing to cooperate. This made Guai Xian, who was anxious, unable to sleep. He had no choice but to call Nalan to his room. Guai Xian bluntly said that he was very uncertain about the future. This time, the magic software was likely to fail. However, Nalan did not think so. She said that Guai Xian's decision to ask Luo Wei for help was a perfect strategy. Guai Xian could tell that Nalan was trying to comfort him, so he said with a hint of disappointment that failure was not scary. After all, he had experienced this countless times before, but this time was different because he and Nalan had created the company together. Guai Xian lamented that he had once been poor and powerless, so he wanted to devote all his energy to developing the magic software. He wanted to be able to meet Nalan with dignity once the software was successful. However, reality was always contrary to his wishes. On the day of his success, he mistook Wendy for Nalan. His outrageous behavior of mistaking the wrong girl for his girlfriend caused him to spend every day and night in regret. Nalan listened, hung her head, and remained silent. Guai Xian saw that she still hadn't forgiven him, so he got up awkwardly and prepared to leave. But when he walked to the door, he suddenly stopped. Like a child who had lost his soul, he immediately turned back and crouched down in front of Nalan. He sincerely admitted that he had come to see her just to hear her voice again. Nalan looked at Guai Xian, who was both wronged and pitiful, and shouted out the words that had left a deep impression on him. Guai Xian, are you dead? Guai Xian, are you dead? Nalan's voice was like a life-saving injection. It was like bright sunlight piercing through the dark night. causing Gua Xian's lips to curve slightly upward. He finally showed a hint of a confident smile. What happened next proved that Gua Xian couldn't live without Na Lan. The next day, Luo Wei, who had been asked to help out at the magic company, made a small suggestion, but Gua Xian strongly opposed it. Seeing that the atmosphere was not right, Luo Wei tactfully left first. Just then, a stranger found Luo Wei and took him to Jin Fei's Research and Development Center. Jin Fei brandished a baseball bat and threatened Luo Wei that if he dared to continue helping Gua Xian, his fate would be dire. Meanwhile, the magic team members discovered Luo Wei's sudden disappearance and grew increasingly anxious. Fortunately, Na Lan quickly realized that this must be Jin Fei's doing. She immediately drove to the Research and Development Center and saw the baseball bat lying on the ground. Realizing that Luo Wei must have been threatened by Jin Fei, Na Lan confronted Jin Fei and successfully brought Luo Wei away. After all, Luo Wei was the only one who could save the magic team. However, there was now a problem. Gua Xian refused to accept Luo Wei's proposal. He wanted to add a video transmission function to the magic software. After a heated argument, Luo Wei suddenly understood why Gua Xian was refusing. It was because he simply didn't have the money to rent a server. At that moment, Na Lan stepped forward and agreed to let Luo Wei continue developing the video transmission feature. As for the research and development costs, she would figure it out. Upon hearing this, Gua Xian flew into a rage and demanded to know why Na Lan was making decisions without his consent. Moreover, they couldn't possibly raise the $3 million needed. Just as Na Lan was about to leave, she ran into Wen Di. Wen Di saw her boyfriend entangled with another woman and felt somewhat resentful, so she stopped Gua Xian, who was about to leave, and asked him if he could take her with him. Gua Xian turned away without looking back. What was even more heartbreaking for Wen Di was yet to come. On their way to raise money, Gua Xian bluntly said that he had no idea what to do. He didn't want to lose his hard-earned magic company just like he lost Na Lan. Na Lan comforted him and told him not to lose confidence, saying that she would definitely find a way to help him raise the money. Soon, she took Gua Xian to find the e-commerce tycoon Wei Yunxi and told him that the magic company was in trouble. The company needed to borrow 30 million from him to upgrade the software. However, to their surprise, after some deliberation, Wei Yunxi stated that he did not wish to get involved in the competition between internet software companies. He suggested that they seek assistance from the internet giant Li Benti instead. With no other options, the two drove to Future Company. Unfortunately, Li Benti was not at the office at the time, and the two were received by his secretary. However, the secretary's response was vague and did not clearly indicate whether they would be granted the loan. Gua Xian had less than 20 hours left. Na Lan and Gua Xian felt like they were at a dead end. After all, the waiting period before a decision was made was the most agonizing. Before the magic company went bankrupt, Gua Xian brought Na Lan back to his home. His parents had prepared a generous meal and urged Gua Xian not to give up. As they were leaving, Na Lan couldn't help but envy Gua Xian's happiness, but Gua Xian thought it was because of Na Lan's influence. After all, this was the first time his father had ever treated him so well. Na Lan told him to bring her along next time he went home. Gua Xian felt both ashamed and helpless when he heard this. After all, Na Lan was supposed to be his girlfriend now. When they returned to Magic Company, they found that the team members had been working tirelessly. So when Na Lan persuaded Gua Xian to go rest early, Gua Xian stubbornly said that he would wait for Li Benti's call. Na Lan said that they could take turns waiting for the call. Upon hearing this, Gua Xian reluctantly returned to the office to rest. He hoped that a miracle would happen in the only half day left. When Gua Xian woke up, he found the team members gathered around the computer with serious expressions and no joy at all. He asked dejectedly if the software had been taken down. Seeing everyone look up and remain silent, Gua Xian realized that the company had completely gone bankrupt. Just as he was about to announce the bankruptcy, Li Benti suddenly popped up from behind the computer. Faced with this inexplicable scene, Gua Xian was still confused. At this moment, Li Benti smiled and said that the number of downloads for magic software was skyrocketing. He then solemnly announced that he was prepared to invest 50 million yuan. Upon hearing this, Gua Xian was overjoyed and hugged Li Benti, who had saved him from disaster. But Gua Xian had no idea that Li Benti's sudden appearance was actually for another reason. Last night, he had secretly met with Wei Yunxi. Both of them believed that the magic software and Jiexuan software had unlimited potential in the future, so they were undecided about which company to invest in. In the end, they came up with a perfect strategy. No matter who won, they would consider the other half of the investment as their own. Through this crisis, Wen Di realized that there were major problems within the company, so she volunteered to become the new president of the company. However, Gui Xian didn't take her seriously. After all, the person sitting in front of him was just an imposter. Wen Di secretly resolved to show her strength at the next shareholders' meeting. Her actions ended up completely enraging Gui Xian. Soon, Magic Company held its first shareholders' meeting. The topic was how to deal with the 50 million Li Benti had lent them. Lu Ka suggested converting the 50 million into shares. However, Su Jia believed that Magic Company's future value was limitless. Therefore, he hoped that everyone would collectively raise the money to repay Li Benti. Lu Ka and Yang Li firmly opposed this idea. At this point, Gui Xian couldn't help but wonder if the couple had spent all their money. Lu Ka said that Yang Li was going abroad for breast augmentation. Upon hearing this, everyone burst into laughter. But they didn't realize that Yang Li was on the verge of exploding at any moment. And Wen Di's next words became the fuse that ignited the bomb. Is Magic Company more important than breast augmentation? Everyone realized something was wrong and immediately stopped. Only Wen Di continued to pour oil on the fire. This caused Yang Li, who had always been mild-tempered, to explode in anger. He complained about how they had stayed up all night working during the early days of the startup. He even mentioned how they had nearly been run over by a car during a competitive situation. He then criticized Wen Di, asking her what qualifications she had to talk about the Magic Company. Although Wen Di admitted that she hadn't done anything, she said that as a shareholder, she had the right to refute Yang Li's claims. Yang Li then asked her if she could represent Magic Company. The implication was that Wen Di's behavior of selling herself in exchange for shares was shameful. However, Wen Di retorted that Yang Li was deliberately changing the subject. Since she wasn't being reasonable, she had nothing more to say. Yang Li's words were indeed reasonable, precisely because they had invested so much before. They didn't want to take another risk now. Remember the day before the Magic Company was about to go bankrupt? She was lying on the sofa and had a dream. Wen Di immediately mocked Yang Li for dreaming about getting a breast augmentation. Yang Li, furious and ashamed, left immediately, leaving Wen Di standing there dumbfounded. After returning, Wen Di angrily accused the other shareholders of targeting her. In order to ensure that the two of them had absolute power at the meeting, she even decided to kick all the other shareholders out. She would buy Yang Li Lu Ka's shares. And secondly, she would not allow Gao Di and Su Jia to participate in management. They would only be given a small dividend each year. I will handle this matter to ensure that your shares will not be reduced. Eliminate them all. Gui Xian was utterly shocked. He couldn't believe the woman in front of him could be so ruthless. He warned Wen Di never to mention this again. But Wen Di didn't take it seriously and secretly made her own plans in her mind. The next day, Gui Xian went out of his way to comfort Yang Li at the beauty salon, but Yang Li didn't want to talk to Gui Xian at all. With no other choice, he asked Lu Ka to help him think of a solution. Lu Ka reminded him that Wen Di was not a good person. Every time something happened at the company, she would hide, and once things got better, she would come back and cause trouble. Lu Ka's heartfelt words made Gui Xian fall into deep thought. Just then, Yang Li suddenly rushed in and said, Wen Di is a bad woman. The three of them had been friends for several years, and Wen Di's few words couldn't cause a rift between them. Gui Xian had even become sworn brothers with a dog just to get closer to the woman in front of him, although the two had been in an online relationship for half a year. This was the first time Gui Xian had ever been to Na Lan's house. He said that every time he called her before, he would imagine what her room would look like. Soon, the two of them were reminiscing about the past and how wonderful their online relationship had been. But as time passed, all that beauty was gone. Na Lan lowered her head and said softly that she had called him later. Gui Xian suddenly realized that she had really called him that day. However, when Na Lan heard her best friend Wen Di's voice, she got excited and hung up the phone immediately. Recalling this unfortunate misunderstanding, Gui Xian looked gloomy and regretful. But Na Lan knew very well that it wasn't Gui Xian's fault. The one who started all this was the scheming Wen Di. To ease the awkward atmosphere, Na Lan brought up some lighthearted topics before leaving. She said that her biggest wish was to travel around the world. Coincidentally, this was also Gui Xian's dream, so he excitedly said that he would accompany her on her trip. No matter how far away, he would be by her side. Gui Xian talked incessantly and unconsciously put his hands on Na Lan's shoulders. When he realized that he had gone too far, he quickly took a step back to put some distance between them. Na Lan shyly left silently, but after taking a few steps, she turned around and waved goodbye. After returning home, Wen Di knew that Gui Xian had met with Na Lan. However, she pretended to be casual and asked him where he had been. Gui Xian's straightforward answer made Wen Di's jealousy reach its peak. From then on, she always kept a close eye on Na Lan. No matter where Na Lan went, she followed, even though she was there to discuss work with Gui Xian. Wendy insisted that the two of them were secretly dating behind her back. Seeing this, Gui Xian's face suddenly turned unhappy. He left angrily after saying that they would talk another day. This made the jealous Wendy very unhappy, so she took her anger out on Nalan. Nalan replied bluntly, leaving Wendy speechless. Unable to bear it any longer, she returned home and asked Gui Xian what he meant by his actions today. After a moment of silence, Gui Xian slowly said that he didn't want to talk about it. He also asked Wendy to respect his private life. Although Gui Xian still couldn't let go of Nalan, he had been trying hard to accept Wendy recently. However, the recent mess at the company, coupled with Wendy's increasing desire for control, was suffocating him. Because of this, Wendy desperately wanted to know if Gui Xian still loved her. Wendy admitted that she had indeed been with him for money, but now she had truly fallen in love with Gui Xian, so she really wanted him to give her a clear answer. Gui Xian has always chosen to avoid the issue, but Wendy insists on asking him if there is someone in his heart who comes to mind without even thinking about it. Seeing Wendy crying her heart out, Gui Xian hesitates for a moment before giving his answer. At this moment, Wendy finally lets go. Although she knows very well that Gui Xian is lying to himself, she is still very happy. This is because Wendy can see that Gui Xian has been trying hard to adapt to her. However, when it came to Nalan, she couldn't help but be petty. After all, she really wanted to be with Gui Xian for the rest of her life. After listening to Wendy's heartfelt words, Gui Xian felt complicated and walked up to slowly embrace her. But as the saying goes, fake things can never be real. That day, Jean Fei was exhausted after partying and lay on the bed, but the female model was still wildly shaking her head beside him. In a fit of rage, Jean Fei threw a wine bottle at the female model. With a sharp scream, the female model suddenly fell silent. At first, Jean Fei didn't think much of it, but when he got out of bed to turn off the music, he almost tripped over a pair of delicate feet. It was only then that Jean Fei suddenly realized that the female model was lying motionless at his feet. He mistakenly thought that he had killed the female model. In a panic, he hurriedly put her in the refrigerator. Then, completely distraught, he immediately called the butler. It wasn't until early the next morning that the butler received the call and rushed to Jean Fei's residence. Although Jean Fei's shirt was covered in blood, the butler's reaction was extremely calm. No matter what happened, he had to help Jean Fei smooth things over. Jean Fei had done many bad things in his life, but he had always been timid since childhood and had never caused a death before. When Butler Wu was about to open the refrigerator, he was so scared that he screamed repeatedly. Jean Fei then hurriedly curled up in a corner. When Butler Wu slowly opened the refrigerator, he was astonished to find that the female model had disappeared. This made him realize immediately that something was wrong. It wasn't until Jean Fei slowly pieced together the whole strange incident that the two of them discovered that the safe in the room had been opened, and the 500,000 in cash inside had disappeared. Under Butler Wu's repeated questioning, Jean Fei reluctantly revealed that there were a few hard drives containing videos of himself throwing parties that would destroy people's worldviews. Butler Wu immediately demanded to know if the secret list was still in Jean Fei's possession. Jean Fei casually replied that even if the female model had obtained the list, it wouldn't matter. However, Butler Wu flew into a rage upon hearing this. Accusing Jean Fei of causing a major disaster, he immediately spent money to obtain the hotel's surveillance footage. The video showed the female model leaving in a hurry in the middle of the night, taking the hard drives and the list with her. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Butler Wu immediately reported the situation to Jean Jinghua. Jean Fei angrily rebuked the butler for not being able to handle such a small matter. Butler Wu solemnly told Jean Fei that the list contained records of his father's collusion with officials. Once exposed, their entire family could be ruined at any moment. He then told Jean Fei not to interfere in the matter and that he would handle everything himself. Once the hard drive and list were recovered, he would immediately retire. Soon, Jean Jinghua heard the news and rushed over from Hong Kong. As soon as he saw Butler Wu, he flew into a rage and was about to beat Jean Fei to a pulp. Fortunately, Butler Wu stopped him and took all the blame upon himself. After calming down, Jean Jinghua told his son with great pain in his heart that the big names on the list were all people he had cultivated over decades. He had given the list to Jean Fei so that if something happened to him, Jean Fei could use it to protect himself. He never imagined that he was still alive. Yet Jean Fei had lost the list. At this point, Jean Fei still did not realize the seriousness of the situation. Fortunately, he had a father who doted on him and a reliable butler. Considering the circumstances, Jean Jinghua guessed that the model was trying to extort money. However, Butler Wu believed that it was better to remain calm. Although the female model's cell phone was turned off, a girl like her would show up sooner or later. Therefore, He hoped that Jean Jinghua would leave the matter entirely to him. When Hu Wei's sister learned about this, she immediately decided to blackmail the other party for a large sum of money. Hu Wei said that there was a silent old man who looked very fierce around Jean Fei. Meanwhile, Butler Wu contacted a top mercenary who had been working in France for 9 years and paid him a hefty sum. He also demanded that he retrieve the lost hard drive and list. On the agreed upon day, Hu Wei, out of fear, handed the matter over to her sister to handle. When Butler Wu arrived at the location, he did not find Hu Wei. At this point, Hu Wei's sister explained that she was fully in charge of the matter. She also demanded an exorbitant sum of 20 million. Butler Wu was stunned upon hearing this, but to keep the other party calm, he agreed readily. As the saying goes, greed never ends well. After leaving the building, Butler Wu immediately signaled to the assassin. The assassin quickly sneaked into the room and killed Hu Wei's sister. However, after searching the entire house, they did not find the list or the hard drive they were looking for. As he was leaving, he suddenly rushed toward the adjacent room. Although he was certain that Hu Wei was inside, he calmly chose to leave. The reason was that the butler had only paid him for one person. Hu Wei rushed into the room and found her sister brutally murdered at home. She immediately ran out the door and pressed the elevator button. However, while waiting, she suddenly sensed danger. With no other option, Hu Wei chose to escape through the fire escape. Unfortunately, this was precisely the moment the assassin spotted her. The assassin immediately gave chase but was unable to catch up with Hu Wei, who was wearing high heels. Meanwhile, Hu Wei randomly chose a floor and blended into the crowd. At that time, the butler had already provided Hu Wei's photo. However, the assassin scanned the elevator's reflection but failed to spot her. Thus, Hu Wei successfully escaped under the assassin's nose. Soon, Butler Wu reported the incident to Jean Jinghua. Jean Jinghua was worried that Hu Wei would give the name to the police to protect herself. However, Butler Wu confidently said that money could solve everything. Just as Butler Wu had expected, Hu Wei did not choose to call the police. Instead, she returned to the residence and decided to flee with the money. However, just as she was about to leave, her mother suddenly called her. It turned out that Butler Wu had a trick up his sleeve and had tricked Hu Wei's parents into coming to Beijing. He lied and said that Hu Wei was in a relationship with their son. Hu Wei's parents were overjoyed upon hearing this. However, Hu Wei could no longer stay calm and began to desperately explain. She claimed that it was all her sister's idea and that she hoped Butler Wu would spare her parents. Hu Wei couldn't believe that the hard drive and the list were so important to them. She immediately retrieved the two items from under the bed. The list documented the other parties' improper transactions with officials, while the hard drive contained videos of Jean Fei's parties that were utterly shocking. So, if either of these items were made public, the other party could face ruin at any moment. Thus, Hu Wei began searching online for information about Jean Fei with a skeptical attitude. However, as she searched, she accidentally discovered that Jean Fei's company was currently involved in a lawsuit with a company called Guaixin. Hu Wei thought of her murdered sister and her kidnapped parents, and she hated Jean Fei with all her heart. So, to protect herself or seek revenge, she rushed to deliver the evidence to Magic Company that night. She hoped that one day, through Guaixin's hands, she could bring Jean Fei down. After doing all this, Hu Wei approached Butler Wu with a nervous and anxious heart. Butler Wu put on a friendly facade, but the murderous intent emanating from his core sent a chill down Hu Wei's spine. Butler Wu placed 2 plates of leftovers in front of her and thoughtfully handed her a pair of chopsticks. Seeing that Hu Wei hesitated to pick up the chopsticks, he immediately changed his expression. Then Butler Wu chatted with Hu Wei like an elder, telling her that he had a particularly well-behaved son, who, if he were still alive, would be about the same age as Hu Wei, so he could particularly understand the feelings of parents. Just now, he had talked a lot with Hu Wei's parents. Hu Wei's parents had saved some money for their daughter by living frugally. They hoped their daughter could marry into a good family and live a life of glory. When Hu Wei was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, Butler Wu suddenly changed his attitude and took off the hat on her head. At this point, Hu Wei still did not reveal the whereabouts of the evidence. So the next day, Butler Wu reported to Jean Jinghua that although he had control over Hu Wei and her parents, the evidence had been hidden by Hu Wei. Jean Jinghua believed that the images on his son's hard drive were unspeakable, so he wanted to take advantage of his presence to clean up his son's private life. To this end, Butler Wu brought Jean Fei's few friends from the nightclub. Jean Fei didn't understand Butler Wu's intentions, so he followed them. Butler Wu brought them all to a sports stadium. As soon as they met, Jean Jinghua scolded the two of them. He even shamelessly said that Jean Fei was a good child. Then Butler Wu took the two friends away from the stadium. Jean Fei couldn't take it anymore and yelled at his son. At that moment, Butler Wu returned and told Jin Fei to behave himself in the future. The two thought that this would cover up Jin Fei's crimes. In fact, the hard drive had already fallen into Gui Xian's hands. Lu Ka opened the computer and discovered that the man in the video was actually Jin Fei, the company's arch-rival. He was very curious and asked where the hard drive came from. However, Yang Li said she didn't know either. Faced with such unspeakable scenes in the video, Lu Ka's first thought was to hand it over to the police. But Yang Li believed that such explosive content should be shown to Gui Xian first. After watching the video, Gui Xian was astonished. He was also particularly puzzled as to what the person who sent them the video was trying to achieve. After thinking for a moment, Yang Li suddenly remembered that they were currently in a lawsuit with Jin Fei. If they handed this over to the police, it would mean their lawsuit would be over. At this point, Gui Xian had not yet realized the seriousness of the situation, and this hard drive would soon bring a deadly danger to the group. That evening, Gui Xian and Wendy returned home and were shocked to find the security door wide open. Upon entering, they discovered the room had been completely ransacked. What was even more peculiar was that although the safe in the room had been pried open, the money and jewelry inside were all still there. Gui Xian immediately became alert. He couldn't help but suspect that this might have something to do with Jin Fei's hard drive. Gui Xian immediately called Lu Ka and Yang Li. For their safety, he advised them to leave the house and hide somewhere else first. However, Lu Ka didn't think much of it and believed that Gui Xian was being overly sensitive. After hanging up the phone, Lu Ka linked arms with Yang Li and continued walking forward. Little did they know that a killer disguised as a repairman was following them. The killer observed the security cameras while taking out a sledgehammer and closing in on the two. However, just as he was about to strike, an old lady suddenly appeared. Fortunately, Yang Li's mother appeared just in time, allowing the two to escape unharmed. After she left, the parking lot was empty. Yang Li always felt like someone was following them. Lu Ka told her not to think too much. At the same time, Gui Xian knew that Jin Fei's gang was ruthless, so he immediately packed his things and prepared to move. He first arranged for Wendy to stay at a hotel, then hurried back to the company. But when he entered the office, he found that it was also a mess, just like his home. Fortunately, Gui Xian found the hard drive he had hidden in a secret place. At the same time, Butler Wu found Jin Jinghua and told him that the hard drive had been handed over to Gui Xian by the female model. However, when he sent people to search Gui Xian's home and the magic company, they found nothing. Jin Jinghua mistakenly believed that all of this was a trap set by Gui Xian to force him to drop the lawsuit. "We're just blocking the magic company's money flow. They want our lives." Jin Jinghua then glared at Butler Wu and ordered him to go to the magic company first to probe Gui Xian's intentions. The next day, when Gui Xian saw Butler Wu, he immediately realized that everything that had happened the previous night was the other party's doing. At first, Butler Wu still looked unfriendly, but when he found out that Gui Xian had already watched the video on the hard drive, he immediately put on a humble and submissive expression. He begged Gui Xian to return the hard drive to him. Gui Xian remained unmoved, so Butler Wu began to threaten him in a harsh tone. He claimed that he would hand the hard drive over to the police. Helpless, Butler Wu had no choice but to resort to his old tricks. He talked about human ethics and rules. What he didn't expect was that young people nowadays didn't buy into that kind of thing at all. Gui Xian's gaze grew even more fierce, and he roughly pushed Butler Wu out the door. Seeing that the other party wasn't following his so-called rules, Jin Jinghua made up his mind to fight to the death. Now, Gui Xian had only one way to break the deadlock: find the internet giant Li Benti to intervene. Just as Li Benti was about to meet with the two, his secretary suddenly informed him that Jin Jinghua was already downstairs. Li Benti never expected that both sides would find him at the same time. However, due to Jin Jinghua's power and status, Li Benti had no choice but to meet with him first. As soon as the two sat down, Jin Jinghua got straight to the point and talked about the lawsuit. But his ultimate goal was to put pressure on Li Benti. Jin Jinghua made his position clear, and Li Benti responded with a few vague words. Then, he pretended to leave for 10 minutes, but in reality, he went downstairs to meet Gui Xian urgently. He first glanced at the testimony prepared by Nalan. Then he solemnly told Gui Xian that his situation was dire, because Jin Jinghua had been actively lobbying. Gui Xian felt a chill run down his spine upon hearing this. He looked at Li Benti, who had been pouring cold water on him the whole time. He asked in frustration, "Is Magic Company really finished?" Li Benti then went to see Jin Jinghua again and begged him to spare Gui Xian. Unfortunately, Jin Jinghua refused. Li Benti had no choice but to reason with him. He bluntly said that he had seen Na Lan's testimony. He advised him that it would be best not to destroy Gui Xian, otherwise no one would come out of it well. Seeing Jin Jinghua's face darken, Li Benti smiled and proposed a compromise. That was to have Magic Software also start charging fees. This way, the two companies could compete on an equal footing. After pondering for a long time, Jin Jinhua finally agreed to the proposal. However, the condition was that Guixian must sign a guarantee of payment. Otherwise, he would no longer spare Li Benti's face. As a result, Li Benti immediately dispatched a lawyer to the Magic Company to read out the mediation proposal in person. He hoped that the Magic Company would charge fees according to the standards of telecom operators. At the same time, Wendy also expressed acceptance of the mediation proposal. However, Guixian did not agree, as this went against the original purpose of creating the software. Therefore, he now only wanted to know how likely he was to win if he insisted on going to court. The lawyer immediately stated that there was no possibility at all. Upon hearing this, the shareholders' attitudes shifted toward accepting mediation. Guixian flew into a rage, believing that temporary concessions would only embolden the opponent. Therefore, he declared that he would no longer accept any mediation and would continue the lawsuit to the end. After speaking, he turned and left without looking back. Soon, the lawyer reported this matter to Li Benti. Li Benti was shocked upon hearing this, as this was something he had fought hard to achieve. Therefore, Li Benti angrily sought out Guixian and told him how hard he had worked on the mediation plan. He even humbled himself in front of Jin Jinhua. Guixian expressed his opinion on the disadvantages of charging for magic. However, Li Benti believed that now was not the time to talk about the future, but how to survive. He persuaded Guixian to reach a settlement with the other party first, but Guixian was adamant that he would not compromise. After Li Benti left, Guixian suddenly received a mysterious phone call. Yang Li complained that Lu Ka only knew how to be loyal, but Lu Ka, who always listened to her, firmly believed that his good friend would definitely help him start a successful business this time. Upon hearing this, Yang Li flew into a rage. After all, she was doing this for the sake of her family. Lu Ka was so angry that he pushed Yang Li. During the argument, the feisty Yang Li accidentally knocked Lu Ka's computer onto the floor. Seeing that Lu Ka was only concerned with fixing his computer and not trying to appease her, Yang Li ran away from home. The actions of the two gave the killer hiding in the basement an opportunity to strike. Seeing Yang Li leave alone, the killer immediately carried a black bag upstairs. Judging from its appearance, it contained a corpse. It was soon midnight. After finishing writing the program, Lu Ka went to the bathroom in a daze. But when he passed by the room, he found someone lying on the bed. At first, he thought it was Yang Li who had returned, so he didn't pay any attention to it. He even muttered under his breath, "If you're so capable, don't come back." However, he never expected that early the next morning, Lu Ka woke up with bleary eyes. He pushed Yang Li, who was still fast asleep, and found that his hands were covered in blood. In panic, he suddenly pulled Yang Li's sideways body toward him, only to discover in horror that the woman on the bed was not Yang Li, and her forehead was covered in blood. Lu Ka was so scared that he instantly snapped out of his daze, rolled off the bed, and huddled in the corner of the wall, trembling uncontrollably. Soon, Guixian received a call from Yang Li. The group hurried to the police station. Seeing Yang Li crying and looking remorseful, Guixian realized that something had happened to Lu Ka. Just as he was at a loss for what to do, Butler Wu suddenly called him. Guixian angrily demanded to know why Butler Wu had framed Lu Ka. Butler Wu first pretended to be innocent. Then he gave Guixian an address, hoping to meet him and talk things over. Soon, Guixian arrived at an abandoned warehouse according to the address. As soon as they met, he pointed at Butler Wu's nose and gave him a good scolding. Butler Wu no longer hid anything and admitted that he was responsible for Lu Ka's incident. However, if Guixian wanted to settle this matter, he had to agree to two conditions. First, he had to hand over the hard drive containing the crime of their young master. Second, he must immediately shut down the company. Enraged, Guixian swung his arm and punched Butler Wu in the face. After venting his anger, Guixian drove off. He then returned to Magic Company and hired a defense lawyer for Lu Ka. He claimed that this was a clear case of framing and framing. At the same time, he complained to the lawyer that according to regulations, they should release the suspect within 48 hours. The lawyer then produced photos showing that the police accused Lu Ka of hitting the victim on the back of the head with a wine bottle. Additionally, Lu Ka's fingerprints were found on the bottle, and the evidence chain was now complete. This indicated that Lu Ka had been drinking that night, had an argument with his fiancée, and was likely involved in an improper transaction with the victim. Due to some reason, he accidentally killed her. Guixian lost control of his emotions, enraging the lawyer, who left immediately. Shortly after, Gua Xian calmed down and immediately went to the adjacent room to comfort Yang Li. He stated that the other party had raised the price, demanding he hand over the hard drive and shut down the company. I would rather lose my magic than lose my brother. Upon hearing this, Yang Li felt both moved and regretful. Moved because Gua Xian was willing to give up everything for his brother. Regretful because last night she had desperately tried to stop Lu Ka from borrowing money from Gua Xian. Since his best friend was framed and imprisoned, Gua Xian had made up his mind to sell the company, although the shareholders were highly dissatisfied with his decision, including his girlfriend Wen Di, who was also a shareholder. They dared not stand up to Gua Xian's fiery temper, so the three gathered together. During this time, they sighed and lamented constantly. After all, since the magic company was founded, everyone except Wen Di had put in a lot of effort, and the future prospects were limitless. But now, to sell it so easily, anyone would feel a sense of reluctance. Wen Di was the last person who wanted to sell the magic company, as she also held a 5% stake in the company, but there was nothing she could do, as Gua Xian hadn't returned home for a long time. Just then, Wen Di suddenly thought of someone. That person was Gua Xian's longtime crush, Na Lan. Na Lan said she was also helpless because she knew Gua Xian very well. No matter how much pressure he faced from the outside world, he could withstand it. But when it came to the people close to him, that was his Achilles heel. He was too soft-hearted. Just as Wen Di was still trying to persuade him, she was suddenly called into President Peng's office. He handed her a letter of intent to acquire the company, stating that they wanted to acquire all the shares of the magic company. Wen Di read it and immediately flew into a rage, believing that President Peng was kicking someone when they were down. But President Peng turned around and criticized Wen Di. As a shareholder of magic company, you naturally feel some resentment. You're receiving a salary from Luffy's company and a hefty bonus. Do you think the money in my company just blows in with the wind? Wen Di was making money on both sides, working for the investment company and magic company, but when a crisis arose, she couldn't offer a single opinion. Because of this, President Peng gave her a special task. That was to accompany Wen Di to meet Gua Xian and try her best to persuade him to sign the contract. Wen Di was caught in a dilemma. She had no choice but to accompany President Peng to Magic Company. After reading the letter of intent, Gua Xian tactfully said that he would consult with the other shareholders. Just then, President Peng gave Wen Di a look. Gua Xian looked at the extremely low price of the shares and felt extremely indignant. But compared to saving his good friend, he had no time to pay attention to these details. So, without hesitation, he signed the contract. When President Peng saw Wen Di's face, he smiled with relief. Late at night, Gua Xian returned home and found Wen Di still waiting for him. He immediately guessed that she had something to say. Sure enough, as he was about to go to bed, Wen Di called him over. Wen Di complained that he shouldn't have become so negative because of Lu Ka's incident. You can't abandon the interests of all of us for your brotherly loyalty. Anyone has the right to say that to him, but not Wen Di, because she had never contributed a single penny to the company. Moreover, the 5% shares she owned were obtained by deceiving Gua Xian. Then she brought up the other shareholders as a shield, saying that what she had just said was also their opinion. Gua Xian clearly stated that he could give up all his interests in the company, but he had to save his brother. These words had been bottled up in his heart for a long time. Gua Xian said that he really wanted to live a good life with her, but after trying hard, he found that he really couldn't do it, because the two of them always had different ideas about people and things. Just as Gua Xian was about to leave, Wen Di suddenly called him back. With a serious look on her face, she asked him if he wanted to break up. Gua Xian slowly turned his head and replied with a resounding yes. From then on, Gua Xian no longer held back and admitted that he never liked her in the first place. At the same time, he knew very well that Wen Di was with him largely because of his money. After saying that, Gua Xian turned away heartlessly, leaving Wen Di standing there dumbfounded. The company was about to go bankrupt, but he was still playing games in the office. Even when all the shareholders were fighting desperately in court, he was lying on the sofa, fast asleep. Gua Xian thought that even if he went, it would be meaningless because his good friend had been framed by his competitors and sent to prison. So even if he lost the company, he had to save his good friend. Na Lan told him to use his brain, that one day the police would surely find out the truth and clear Lu Ka's name. Gua Xian's heart stirred, but his expression remained hesitant. Na Lan saw his wavering resolve and immediately knelt down to continue persuading him. If you really give in, not only will Lu Ka hate you, but I will hate you too. Gua Xian turned his head and looked into Na Lan's sincere eyes, and a new glimmer of hope ignited in his heart. Meanwhile, at the courtroom, the operator made baseless accusations against Magic Company for creating free voice software as embezzlement of state assets. The Magic Company's defense lawyer immediately launched a counterattack. Both sides argued fiercely, each sticking to their own position. Just as the two were locked in a heated debate, Gui Xian suddenly pushed open the door and entered. He then confidently refuted the operator's accusations, stating they were baseless. With his sharp rhetoric, Gui Xian quickly left the other side speechless. After the first phase of the trial concluded, Gui Xian apologetically informed Yang Li that he would have to break his promise. Yang Li understood, as both believed the case was highly likely to be one. However, the situation was not as straightforward as they imagined. Soon, the second trial began, with both sides engaging in another intense legal battle in court. But unexpectedly, just as the proceedings reached a critical juncture, Magic Company's shareholders suddenly received an urgent text message. It turned out that Magic's servers had suddenly gone offline. At the same time, the three major telecom operators also received the notice. However, the corners of their mouths curled into a knowing smile, because all of this had been deliberately arranged by them. Upon receiving the news, Gui Xian rushed back to the company. Gao Di was furious, complaining that the telecom operators had suddenly suspended the servers without any prior notice. According to the contract, they had the right to file a complaint. After all, every half hour the servers were down, they could potentially lose millions of users. However, coincidentally, someone had already called the front desk 40 minutes earlier and vaguely informed them that server maintenance would be conducted. At this point, Wendy believed that suing was pointless. The only option now was to settle with the other party. If Gui Xian agreed, she was willing to have the investment company mediate. With no other choice, Gui Xian had to compromise. Wendy quickly reported the matter to President Peng. Upon hearing this, President Peng found Nalan and told her that the company would organize a cocktail party in a few days to invite the arbitration committee and see if they could reach a settlement. Finally, he asked Nalan to immediately convey this to Gui Xian. On the other side, the two shareholders of Magic were arguing fiercely. Gao Di insisted on hiring a lawyer to sue the operator. However, Su Jia strongly opposed this, believing that his behavior was too naive. Gui Xian not only refused to intervene but returned to his office without saying a word. Just then, Nalan arrived and was shocked to discover that Gui Xian had hacked into the operator's back-end system. This was a blatant criminal act. Nalan immediately pulled the power cord and took out the invitation to the cocktail party from her bag. She instructed Gui Xian to attend the event, as this would be his last chance. Soon, the day of the reception arrived. Jin Fei and his son also attended. Gui Xian couldn't understand why Nalan would invite his rival. Nalan was afraid that Gui Xian would cause a scene at the event. Her fears were soon realized. At first, Gui Xian met with the big shot Li Benti and hoped that he could use his connections to put in a good word for him at the arbitration committee. Li Benti could only comfort Gui Xian, telling him to rely on his own efforts and try to persuade Judge Naguamin. Coincidentally, Naguamin was Nalan's biological father. Therefore, Nalan felt that there might be a turning point in the case. Nalan took Gui Xian's hand and led him to the VIP room. When Di happened to witness this scene and saw the intimate moment between the two, she finally understood why Gui Xian had abandoned her. After all, every time something happened to him, Nalan would unconditionally stay by his side. This time was no different. Nalan introduced Gui Xian to her father as a friend. Unexpectedly, after the two exchanged a few pleasantries, Jin Jinghua suddenly approached them. Because Nalan had once been in a relationship with his son Jin Fei, he had always deliberately brought up their relationship. Gui Xian felt a surge of anger and was about to act, but Nalan quickly stepped in to smooth things over. She stated that she had no relationship with Jin Fei anymore, but Jin Jinghua wouldn't let it go, completely disregarding the feelings of his daughter and son-in-law in front of others. He then said that young people act without thinking and that as an elder, he should teach them a lesson. Everything he said was a subtle hint directed at Gui Xian. Gui Xian also bluntly asked Jin Jinghua why he had multiple wives. The atmosphere immediately became tense. Fortunately, Naguamin was present, so Jin Jinghua had to leave, citing illness. Before leaving, he advised Gui Xian that young people should always strive for the best. Nalan then scolded Gui Xian for offending Jin Jinghua. After all, her purpose in setting up this meeting was to reconcile the two. However, Gui Xian dismissed her concerns and insisted on confronting Jin Jinghua head-on. Unfortunately, his plans were quickly disrupted by Wendy. Wendy approached him and mocked him for only engaging in underhanded tactics behind people's backs. To everyone's surprise, Jin Fei pretended not to be involved and continued playing pool. However, Wendy smiled and warned Gui Xian that given his hot-tempered nature, if he loses the lawsuit, he won't let Jean Fei off the hook for the rest of his life. Upon hearing this, Jean Fei lost all interest, dropped his cue, and left the pool hall in a huff. However, Wendy wasn't about to give up and continued to follow Jean Fei relentlessly. She even used Gui Xian and Na Lan's relationship to mock Jean Fei. Na Lan, seeing her best friend being bullied, angrily stepped forward and scolded Jean Fei for being shameless. But Jean Fei, who was usually fearless, had no answer for Na Lan. Na Lan then turned to comfort the distraught Wendy. She took her to the break room and urged her to vent her grievances. Na Lan quickly denied it, but Wendy coldly laughed and told her not to hide anything, because she had already discovered that Gui Xian listened to Na Lan's voice every night before falling asleep. Na Lan urged her to calm down and explained that the voice recording was from their online dating days. It wasn't something she intentionally called Gui Xian for. Wendy insisted that she had just seen Na Lan take Gui Xian's hand voluntarily, and the smug look on her face was impossible to hide. Wendy accused Na Lan of destroying her happiness, but Na Lan didn't get angry when she heard this. Instead, she was very considerate and handed her a tissue. On the other side, Lu Ka, who had been framed by Jean Fei and sent to prison, was suddenly released from the detention center. Gui Xian was very excited when he heard this news. After all, he had almost given up the entire company to save his brother, so he rushed to the hotel entrance to greet him. The two brothers embraced tightly upon seeing each other. After exchanging greetings, Gui Xian curiously asked Lu Ka how he had cleared his name. Moreover, Hu Wei's injuries were not caused by a wine bottle. Most importantly, surveillance footage from the hallway showed someone carrying Hu Wei upstairs that night. However, all the evidence pointed to this being a case of framing someone else for the crime. Both of them knew that Jean Fei was the mastermind behind everything. Just as they were about to leave, Lu Ka suddenly spotted Jean Fei in the distance. He swung his fist hard into Jean Fei's face. Both men fell to the ground, and Jean Fei clutched his face, screaming in agony. But Lu Ka continued to beat him mercilessly. Just then, Butler Wu, who had reacted quickly, pulled the two men apart. While Butler Wu and Lu Ka were struggling, a waiter suddenly rushed out of the crowd and stabbed Jean Fei in the chest with a knife in the blink of an eye. Gui Xian and Lu Ka were stunned. It turned out that the waiter was Hu Wei's boyfriend. He had done this to avenge his girlfriend. Soon, all the suspects were taken to the police station. After a while, the two completed the necessary procedures. Just then, Yang Li rushed over. She went home to retrieve a hard drive containing evidence of Jean Fei's crimes. Gui Xian took the hard drive and immediately handed it over to the police. Jean Fei had not been fatally wounded and survived. After the commotion, Butler Wu advised Jean Jinghua to close the company and drop the lawsuit against Gui Xian. After all, a life had been endangered. However, Jean Jinghua refused to admit defeat. Gui Xian spent his days playing video games at an entertainment center. Na Lan couldn't understand why the once ambitious Gui Xian had become so self-destructive. She shut off the game console and accused Gui Xian of acting like a child. But Gui Xian believed that the lawsuit was already lost. Rather than waiting for the company to slowly go bankrupt, it would be better to get out early and enjoy life. Na Lan was very dissatisfied with Gui Xian's attitude and turned away without looking back. At this moment, Gui Xian suddenly realized his mistake and immediately got up to chase after her. Na Lan said that if even Gui Xian himself had given up, then there was really no one who could help him. Under her supervision and guidance, Gui Xian rewrote the defense statement for the lawsuit. However, after careful consideration, Gui Xian felt that this would not change anything. Both of them firmly believed that Magic Company could be revived. This matter was not as simple as they had imagined. Soon, Na Lan returned to the investment company and discovered that President Peng was preparing to sell Magic Company. Na Lan asked President Peng in a harsh tone, "Since the arbitration result hasn't come out yet, why are you so sure that Magic Company is doomed?" She was certain that selling Magic Company at this moment would be the biggest mistake of President Peng's life. President Peng had heard from a side source that Li Benti was trying to acquire Magic Company, so even if Magic Company won the lawsuit, Li Benti would never keep a tiger in his house. At this point, Magic Company had no way out. However, while that was the case, Li Benti's situation wasn't exactly rosy either. The reason was that the other 4 shareholders didn't support his acquisition of Magic Company. Their reasoning was that once Magic Company lost the lawsuit next month, it would be quickly eliminated by the market. Li Benti believed that rather than fighting to the death with a company on the brink of collapse, it would be better to acquire it at a low price while it was facing legal troubles. After saying all this, Li Benti hoped that the shareholders would make a decision. However, after looking at each other, The shareholders replied that they were too old and didn't want to go through all the trouble anymore. They also hoped that Lee Benty would go with them to Australia to enjoy life. When Lee Benty finished using the restroom, he found that the door had been locked. Luo Wei asked for 5 minutes of his time. He had a project worth hundreds of billions of dollars in his hands. Lee Benty had originally wanted to spend 5 minutes reading a joke. Luo Wei's subsequent performance completely changed his fate. Luo Wei quickly began to assemble the chart stand he had prepared in advance. In just a few seconds, a project plan for voice software appeared before Lee Benty's eyes. As soon as he came up, Luo Wei explained his point of view. First of all, he believed that Guixian's magic software was doomed to fail. The reason was that the voice chat function was too simple. Therefore, he designed this software with many additional functions. He wanted to use Lee Benty's company's technology to complete the basic construction of a virtual community for voice and images as soon as possible. Lee Benty's expression was intriguing. Perhaps this was what he was really thinking at that moment. But after all, this was not child's play, because Luo Wei's design of this software would first offend Guixian's magic company, then it would force social software out of business, followed by the 3 major operators, chat rooms, and forums. Luo Wei knew very well that his words had completely moved Lee Benty. Therefore, he confidently said that this was a historic opportunity. If Lee Benty was afraid of death, he promised that he would never bother him again. Sure enough, Lee Benty changed his usual gentle demeanor and became fierce and terrifying. The two seemed to have reached some kind of agreement, but the truth was much more complicated than we imagined. Before that, Luo Wei had also asked Wei Yunqi to invest in his project. However, there was a crucial difference. Luo Wei had concealed the fact that he was developing an e-commerce platform from Wei Yunqi. Coincidentally, Wei Yunqi had no interest in chat software, so he politely declined Luo Wei's offer. As a result, Luo Wei turned to Lee Benty. What he didn't know was that Wei Yunqi and Lee Benty were close friends in private. After all, e-commerce was the most profitable venture at the time. Soon after, Luo Wei approached Lee Benty once more. Lee Benty complained to Luo Wei about approaching Wei Yunqi and keeping the e-commerce project a secret from him. Luo Wei was a shrewd individual and understood that Lee Benty was merely putting on airs. After all, business tycoons of their caliber rarely have spotless entrepreneurial backgrounds. The camera then zoomed out as the two exchanged whispers. Soon, Lee Benty tracked down Luo Wei's underground workshop. Luo Wei was utterly shocked and fumbled around before inviting Lee Benty into the basement. He had assumed the other party was there to discuss a partnership, but the situation was not as simple as he had imagined. Because Lee Benty immediately returned the USB drive containing the presentation materials to Luo Wei. Just as Lee Benty was about to leave, Luo Wei suddenly called him back and requested a private conversation. In the basement, Luo Wei was convinced that Lee Benty must have something on his mind. Otherwise, someone of his status wouldn't have gone out of his way to return a broken USB drive. Lee Benty didn't argue, only saying that Luo Wei could come to him anytime if he needed help with anything. He even gave him a high five before leaving, and it was that high five that completely changed the course of their lives. After leaving the basement, Lee Benty solemnly reminded his secretary. It turned out that Lee Benty's idea to develop new software had been strongly opposed by the other 4 shareholders of the company. So he gathered the 4 of them together once again and delivered a passionate speech about entrepreneurship. He stated that the mobile internet war was evolving rapidly. If they didn't make changes, their company could be eliminated at any moment. However, despite his words, the shareholders remained unwilling to accept. Their reason was that they were too old to go through all that again. At that moment, Lee Benty had already made up his mind to start over. This also meant that he could be kicked out of the board at any time. But for someone pursuing his dreams, that no longer mattered. As a result, Lee Benty immediately sent someone to bring Luo Wei to the company. First, he confiscated Luo Wei's phone. He also demanded that he not contact anyone outside the company. At the same time, he secretly arranged for a large villa in the countryside for him, and ordered him to complete the basic framework of the software within 15 days. However, Luo Wei believed that half a month was simply insufficient, because even if he completed the software and handed it over to Lee Benty for board approval, it would still take at least a month. At this point, Luo Wei suddenly realized that Lee Benty's unspoken concern was that he had not obtained the board's support. Lee Benty didn't care at all because their upcoming operation could potentially make history. Seeing this, Luo Wei no longer doubted him and decided to join him in a desperate battle. Soon, the secretary took Luo Wei to a secret base and pointed to a dilapidated warehouse, indicating that this was the research and development location Lee Benty had arranged for him. What surprised Luo Wei even more was that his subordinate had already been sent here. It seemed that Lee Benty had already planned everything in advance. Luo Wei didn't pay much attention to it. After all, everyone would feel excited at first. However, ideals are always lofty. but reality is always cruel. In the days that followed, the two of them could only eat steamed buns with instant noodles. Even the subordinate beside him felt sorry for him and hesitated to ask if he was just going to accept this fate. At this point, Luo Wei started to vent his frustration, saying that they were starting a business, so wasn't it normal to endure some hardships? In the days that followed, the two brothers spent half a month in this isolated place, gradually falling into deep thought. Just as the two brothers were feeling lost, a ray of light suddenly appeared before them. Li Benti took advantage of the quiet night to secretly meet with Luo Wei. He then got straight to the point and asked him to come up with a name for the software. From Li Benti's recent behavior, it was clear that he had fully accepted Luo Wei. He then urgently asked Luo Wei to find a group of highly skilled software engineers. He could pay the engineers high salaries and provide research and development funds beyond their imagination. However, the prerequisite was that they must sign a non-disclosure agreement, be managed uniformly, and not contact the outside world. Luo Wei understood Li Benti's approach, but there was one thing that particularly piqued his curiosity. That was whether Li Benti was truly willing to risk bankruptcy and take a desperate gamble with him, an unknown nobody. At the same time, Lu Ka didn't work hard and locked himself in his room all day playing video games. When his girlfriend approached him to show her concern, he pushed her aside. Fortunately, Guo Xian arrived in time and forced him to calm down. Lu Ka asked him in an angry tone what he wanted. In fact, Guo Xian was also feeling frustrated. He became angry and shouted at him to get lost. Lu Ka felt very wronged, but he tried his best to control his emotions. He complained that he had been framed by his competitors and sent to prison, and he didn't know why he had to suffer so much. Moreover, he could see that the company was about to be ruined, but they didn't even have a chance to fight back. Seeing that Lu Ka was becoming more and more emotional, Yang Li hurriedly stepped forward to smooth things over. Then she prepared to forcefully take Lu Ka away from there. Guo Xian also felt wronged, as the president had to endure more than anyone else. Afterward, shareholder Gao Di gathered everyone together and announced a new rule. From now on, no matter how much resentment or emotion anyone felt, they were not allowed to vent their anger at Guo Xian. At this point, Su Jia added another rule: no matter whether the lawsuit was won or lost, they must face it calmly. Because their competitor Jin Jinguo was far more formidable than they had imagined. Just as Lu Ka was still venting his frustration, Jin Jinguo specifically arranged a meeting with Guo Xian. The butler even went to the door to greet him and extended his hand for a handshake. However, Guo Xian ignored him and walked straight past. Upon meeting, Jin Jinguo directly pointed out that Guo Xian's situation was dire. He was currently facing a joint lawsuit from the three major telecom operators. At that moment, Jin Jinguo changed his tone, suggesting that there was no need to be enemies and that there might even be room for cooperation. Therefore, he decided to acquire Magic Company at this price. After speaking, he casually tossed the intent agreement to Guo Xian. On the surface, Jin Jinguo said he didn't want to fight anymore, but in reality, it was because he had inadvertently involved a life in this business war. So, to save his own life, he wanted to make peace with Guo Xian. He hoped that Guo Xian would present any conditions he had. Guo Xian suddenly sat up and aggressively demanded an explanation for Lu Ka's frame-up. Jin Jinguo remained silent, so Guo Xian immediately promised that as long as he told him, he would sign the acquisition contract right away. Jin Jinguo seemed to have already anticipated that Guo Xian would make a difficult request, so he deliberately avoided the topic and tried to cover up the truth. Seeing this, Guo Xian laughed contemptuously. First, he expressed his gratitude to Jin Jinguo for giving Magic Company such a high valuation. Then he returned to Magic Company and saw that Lu Ka was still looking dejected, so he described to Lu Ka what he had just experienced. Lu Ka fell silent after hearing this. At that moment, he felt both regret and guilt. He regretted that he shouldn't have complained to Guo Xian. He felt guilty because Guo Xian was willing to give up the entire company to help him clear his name. From then on, Lu Ka finally saw a new ray of hope. Since the last court hearing of Magic Company began, the shareholders had been urging Guo Xian to stay calm. Even if he felt wronged, he should consider the interests of all the shareholders and accept the mediation proposal. Listening to everyone's pleas, Guo Xian remained silent with a solemn expression. Soon, under the presiding judge Nagwamin, the final court hearing regarding the telecom operators' lawsuit against the Magic Company began. The telecom operators immediately resorted to their old tactics, accusing the Magic Voice software of embezzling state-owned assets. At the same time, they also made a big deal out of disrupting the balance of the communications industry. Under pressure, Guo Xian admitted in person that he had said some extreme words before. He even went against his usual behavior and walked forward, bowed, and apologized to the three major operators. Gui Xian's sudden surrender instantly caused an uproar in the audience. The two sides then entered into mediation. However, what Gui Xian did not expect was that the operators did not leave him any way out this time. They demanded that he hand over Magic Company to the operators for control. In short, they wanted Magic Company to operate and develop under the supervision of the operators. The reason was simple. Since the launch of the free voice software Magic, it had had a huge impact on the text messaging and communications businesses of the three major operators. Therefore, in order to protect their own interests, they had no choice but to nip Magic Company in the bud. Seeing this, Gui Xian did not back down and chose to confront the operators head-on. Through internet data analysis, Gui Xian discovered that the fraud rate of the 4G broadband network was as high as 90%. Although internet speeds were significantly reduced, the fees charged to users remained unchanged. For example, roaming fees and SMS messages were only 1 cent per message 10 years ago. However, even today, the cost of sending 1,000 SMS messages across networks in different regions does not exceed 1 yuan, because Gui Xian had exposed their fraud. The telecom operator, angered by being exposed, angrily asked him if he would accept mediation. At this point, Gui Xian bluntly retorted that he would rather destroy the Magic Company with his own hands than hand it over to a band of thieves. Seeing that Gui Xian's remarks were becoming increasingly dangerous, Na Guomin had no choice but to end the arbitration early, and stated that the arbitration results would be announced 15 days later. As soon as the trial ended, Na Guomin invited Gui Xian to his home for dinner. However, he had a special task that required him to inquire about certain matters from Gui Xian. What should have been a serious scene was suddenly interrupted by Na Lan's mother. She confronted Gui Xian about whether he had a failed marriage. Gui Xian froze upon hearing this. Na Lan hurriedly pulled her mother into the kitchen. Na Guomin was deeply moved by this arbitration. Especially Gui Xian's criticism of the telecom industry had caught the attention of higher-ups. Therefore, he was instructed to have a special discussion with Gui Xian about his views and opinions on the current state of the telecom industry. At first, Gui Xian was a bit reserved, but with Na Lan's encouragement, he started speaking freely again. He pointed out the flaws in the telecom industry in a profound and direct manner. Unexpectedly, just as the two were deep in conversation, Na Lan's mother suddenly came over and interrupted, asking Gui Xian why he had divorced. As the future mother-in-law of her future son-in-law, it was only natural for Na Lan's mother to be a little nosy. Soon after they finished eating, Na Lan walked Gui Xian to the door. Halfway there, she curiously asked Gui Xian how he was able to handle so much pressure. Gui Xian replied without hesitation, "Because of you." Na Lan blushed upon hearing this, but after calming down, she seriously asked Gui Xian to promise her that no matter the outcome of the arbitration, he must not choose to run away. "If you really want to wander, tell me, and I'll go with you." Gui Xian wasn't stupid. He could hear the underlying meaning in her words. Faced with Na Lan's heartfelt confession, his heart warmed, and he immediately embraced her. But Magic Company was in danger, so he had to save his dream first. Jin Fei was still brooding over being stabbed. After all, it was his father who caused this. Just as Jin Fei decided to find his father and ask him for an explanation, the police suddenly came to his door. First, someone had reported his messy private life using a hard drive. Second, they had found out the true identity of the assassin waiter. Jin Fei was stunned because this matter had implicated himself. The police found a video on the hard drive that proved Jin Fei had an improper relationship with the deceased Hu Wei. Coincidentally, Hu Wei's fiancée had stabbed him. Therefore, the police suspected that he was connected to Hu Wei's murder. Jin Fei immediately told them his whereabouts on the day of the incident. After all, this matter had nothing to do with him. The police confirmed this and ruled him out as a suspect. However, they instructed him not to leave Beijing until the case was fully investigated. Jin Fei was furious, as he was certain his father was behind everything. That day, he went to find his father. Filled with resentment, he claimed he had seen his father kill someone when he was 6 years old. Jin Jingwei explained that the man had posed a threat to their entire family. He then asked Jin Fei if what he had done was wrong. Jin Fei dismissed this and stood up, unleashing all the pent-up resentment he had been holding in for years. He had started the company just to win back his ex-girlfriend, but who would have thought that Jin Jingwo would meddle in it? In the end, the matter escalated, and he was dragged into this mess. Jin Jingwo believed that although it was just a small company, he hoped that Jin Fei would learn to be a decent person while pursuing love. Jin Fei laughed contemptuously after hearing this. He admitted that he was not a good person. But Jin Jingwo was far more terrifying than he had imagined. He had ordered his butler to kill Hu Wei, causing her boyfriend to stab him in revenge. Although Jean Fei liked to drink, he had never done anything wrong. The more Jean Fei spoke, the more excited he became. And Jean Jinghua slapped him across the face. Then he turned and left without looking back. He thought the storm had passed, but the nightmare for father and son had just begun. The next day, Jean Jinghua called Jean Fei to his side and admitted that he had caused him a lot of trouble. So, for his safety, Jean Jinghua bought him a plane ticket to Hong Kong. Jean Fei was a little confused. After all, the police would not allow him to leave Beijing. He would only be able to regain his freedom after the matter was settled. Jean Fei was very unhappy because he had been used to living a carefree life since childhood and didn't like being restricted. The reason was that the police might investigate him at any time, so he hoped that Jean Fei could help him protect the family business. That night, Na Lan brought her father to Magic Company. As soon as they entered the door, they heard Guai Xian snoring loudly. Na Lan saw this and hurried over to wake him up. Guai Xian looked completely confused and asked her sleepily what she was doing at the company in the middle of the night. Na Lan said her father had come to discuss something important. Upon hearing this, Guai Xian snapped awake. After all, Na Guomin was now his only hope. Lu Ka saw Na Guomin and was startled into standing up as well. The group then went to the conference room, but Na Guomin's next move left everyone baffled. First, he asked Guai Xian to notify all employees to report to the company at 5 a.m. sharp the next morning. Not only did they have to wear formal attire, but they also had to bring their ID cards. Then he said that he had drafted a report outline and asked Guai Xian to memorize it before dawn. At the same time, he would stay behind with Na Lan to clean up the company. Guai Xian and Lu Ka looked at each other curiously and asked Na Guomin what was going on. Na Guomin hesitated, as this involved organizational discipline, but he still revealed a little to Guai Xian. Guai Xian was stunned and exchanged an incredulous glance with Lu Ka. Later, when Na Guomin went downstairs to check on security issues, Lu Ka was even more excited, saying that the company was finally saved. He also joked with Guai Xian, saying that his future father-in-law was really good at handling things. It was no wonder Guai Xian was so lucky. Every time the company was on the brink of collapse, Na Lan would suddenly step in. After the senior leader's investigation, the three major telecom operators quickly withdrew their lawsuits against Magic Company. Guai Xian was even honored as a national model of scientific and technological innovation. Media reporters swarmed the company, making it impossible to move. But for Guai Xian, who had never experienced such a scene before, it was overwhelming. Butler Wu entered the study and found Jean Jinghua holding the newspaper with Guai Xian's photo on it. He had thought the boss had fallen asleep from reading the newspaper, but when he leaned in closer, he discovered the boss had stopped breathing. Butler Wu worked frantically for half a day and finally revived the boss. Seeing Guai Xian at the peak of his success, Jean Jinghua could only sigh helplessly. Butler Wu hesitated for a moment and claimed that the three major telecom operators now wanted to meet him. Jean Jinghua sighed deeply, his expression unusually calm, as if everything had been expected. After all, having been in the business world for so many years, he had long since seen through everything. Guai Xian returned to the company, escaped the reporters, and came over to take a breath. At that moment, Na Lan rushed over to congratulate him. The two discussed the company's miraculous revival and had a pleasant conversation. Just as they were still immersed in their joy, Wen Di suddenly approached. Not only did he spoil their mood, but he also sarcastically said that Guai Xian had good eyes, and implied that he had abandoned himself and chosen Na Lan solely because of Na Lan's deep family background. Guai Xian was unhappy after hearing this and left immediately after saying that there was too much to say. Na Lan didn't pay much attention to it because Wen Di had done this more than once, so when he returned home that night, Na Lan, contrary to his usual self, found his father to chat. Na Guomin said he wasn't doing this because of Guai Xian, but out of a sense of justice and to protect technological innovation. He also asked Na Lan to tell Guai Xian that if he stayed on the right path, he would gain the support of the leaders. At that moment, Guai Xian was secretly delighted. Just as he was basking in his joy, Na Lan suddenly poured cold water on him. You've only defeated one Jean Jinghua. Next, you might have to face a pack of wolves. The reason was that the success of Magic Company's software had threatened the position of internet tycoon Li Benti. Therefore, he would definitely not stand idly by. However, Guai Xian didn't think much of it and even hoped that the storm would come even more fiercely. That day, Guai Xian was handling media interviews as usual. Just then, Li Benti suddenly appeared, although the two had once been close allies. Na Lan's words constantly reminded Guai Xian. For this, He was grateful to Li Benti for helping him in his time of need. He really didn't know how to repay him. Li Benti got straight to the point and expressed his intention to acquire Magic Company. He persuaded Gui Xian that if he wanted to become bigger and stronger, he must get his support. After hearing this, Gui Xian took a deep breath because he had already anticipated Li Benti's intention. Luo Wei came to his ex-girlfriend to get back together, but she didn't want to have anything to do with him. He promised Wendy that he would make a fortune within 3 months, because he was secretly developing world-class software. Wendy didn't think much of it. After all, if Luo Wei had that kind of ability, she wouldn't have broken up with him in the first place. At this point, Wendy planned to spend 3 months watching him fail. Luo Wei's next move completely blew her away. After leaving Wendy's house, Luo Wei secretly recruited a group of the country's top engineers and brought them to a remote secret base. However, for these outstanding social elites, working in such harsh conditions was nothing short of an insult. Luo Wei admitted that the environment was a bit rough, but he offered them salaries several times higher than their previous ones. Moreover, it was only for 3 months, so everyone saw the situation and didn't say much more. However, what no one expected was that Luo Wei then confiscated everyone's phones. This absurd rule completely crossed the engineer's red line. Seeing the situation about to spiral out of control, Luo Wei lost his temper on the spot. The closed-door work was to prevent the software from being copied before its release. If anyone felt they couldn't adapt, they could get on a bus and leave immediately. For those who stayed, he would grant them corresponding technical shares. Once the software was released, he guaranteed everyone could retire comfortably. Upon hearing this, everyone immediately lost their previous arrogance. After all, Luo Wei had offered far too much. No one would turn down such an offer. Once everyone had handed over their phones, Luo Wei suddenly opened a diagram. If this software were successfully developed, it would undoubtedly revolutionize the history of mobile internet. That day, Luo Wei and his team were having lunch when Ma Hua suddenly came to inspect. Everyone was thrilled to see such a prominent figure. However, just then, an engineer suddenly protested, stating that there was no freedom at all in working here. Luo Wei's assistant replied that he had posted his life here online. Engineer Wang immediately flew into a rage, accusing Luo Wei of monitoring them and infringing on their privacy rights. Luo Wei explained again that they were doing this to prevent leaks. Under Ma Hua's lighthearted banter, everyone finally cleared up their misunderstanding of Luo Wei. Later, the group went for a walk in the suburbs. Ma Hua asked everyone to share their opinions on the software. Engineer Wang spoke first, stating that the software's functions were too complex. However, Ma Hua responded that whether it would succeed should be left to the market to decide. Before leaving, he gave Luo Wei $50,000 in cash, because he felt that the company was not only short-staffed but also lacked skilled professionals. He also told Luo Wei to stay focused on the current project and that he would handle any issues that arose. Originally, Magic Company's valuation had risen to $200 million, which should have been a cause for celebration. However, Gui Xian couldn't help but feel uneasy. He discovered that a software called Queen had suddenly appeared in the mobile app store. It had even surpassed Magic software to claim the top spot on the rankings. Gui Xian couldn't figure it out, so the next day he went to the investment company. There, he accidentally bumped into Queen's founder, Long Xiao. Gui Xian finally understood that the success of this knockoff software was undoubtedly due to President Peng's substantial investment. But then again, Magic Company was also funded by President Peng, so why would he go out of his way to do this? President Peng admitted that Gui Xian valued creativity, while he was focused on business. The logic was simple. Magic Company's market value had risen to $200 million. It was like raising a pig to be slaughtered. At the same time, President Peng reminded Gui Xian to sell his shares in Magic Company while the market was favorable. Gui Xian couldn't understand why he was being so ruthless. It wasn't until Nalan explained it to him that he finally understood. Even Nalan felt that Gui Xian should sell his shares as soon as possible. Therefore, Gui Xian is a good entrepreneur but not a good businessman. He pursues not money but the dream of turning the company into the world's best. However, as soon as he returned to the company, the shareholders immediately arranged interviews for him. This made it impossible for him to work properly. What's more, even the technical director, Lu Ka, had gone out to enjoy life. Gao Di was aware of the inner workings and decided to probe Gui Xian. It turned out that the 4 shareholders had analyzed the situation and were secretly plotting to sell the company. However, Gui Xian didn't take it seriously and even accompanied Lu Ka to a bridal shop to watch Yang Li try on wedding dresses. Normally, it would be understandable for a minor shareholder to take a wedding leave, but Gui Xian believed the current situation was too tense. Therefore, He instructed Lu Ka to expedite the development of the VoIP feature. Lu Ka agreed on the surface, but Gui Xian noticed that he was distracted. At first, he thought it was because he was nervous about the wedding, but to his surprise, after glancing at Yang Li, Lu Ka, like Gao Di, cautiously asked Gui Xian if he had told Wen Di about this matter. It was only then that Gui Xian realized that all the shareholders were keeping something from him. After leaving the bridal shop, Gui Xian went alone to the rooftop to clear his head. Just then, Su Jia rushed over, furious, accusing him of having the leisure to sunbathe. There was a crowd of reporters waiting for him downstairs. Gui Xian spoke angrily, saying that a company facing a crisis should stop holding press conferences and just announce its bankruptcy. Su Jia couldn't help but laugh, saying that their good days were about to come. Gui Xian was completely confused. Ever since Magic Company's market value reached $200 million, the shareholders had all started harboring ulterior motives. However, due to Gui Xian's hot temper, they could only entrust Wen Di to handle the negotiations. Wen Di immediately told Gui Xian that she did indeed love money, but she didn't want to be looked down upon by others. Therefore, she presented her property and shares, intending to return them to Gui Xian. However, Gui Xian would never accept that because he only wanted to know what Wen Di had been beating around the bush for so long. Wen Di no longer held back and said frankly that Magic Company's market value was at its peak and they should seize the opportunity to sell all their shares. She said she had already talked to everyone and they all agreed with her. But Wen Di countered that everyone had dreams and they were just revolving around Gui Xian. Gui Xian angrily rebuked her, saying that she had no right to talk about dreams. Wen Di had no right to do so. After all, she had cheated Gui Xian out of his shares, but she wanted to incite the other shareholders to sell their shares. This was nothing less than betrayal. Early the next morning, Gui Xian called a shareholders meeting. He spoke emotionally about the difficult journey of creating Magic Company and hoped that everyone would give him another chance. Everyone was puzzled. What more could Gui Xian, who had already achieved both fame and fortune, possibly want? However, his passionate speech sounded like a fairy tale to everyone. After the meeting, Wen Di gathered a few people together and reminded them that Gui Xian was the major shareholder. With the shares they held, they had no right to sell the company. At this point, Su Jia wondered if Magic Company was really in such a dire situation that it had to be sold. Wen Di immediately began to analyze the situation, deliberately exaggerating the fatal impact of Queen Software's emergence on Magic Company. Her goal was to deliberately stir up the shareholders' negative emotions. In the end, Wen Di successfully persuaded everyone to nominate herself as the spokesperson for Magic Company. However, her next move was surprising to everyone: to sell her shares. She even went so far as to seek out Gui Xian's arch-rival, Jin Xinghua. However, since the two companies had previously engaged in a fierce battle, Jin Xinghua had no intention of getting involved. Meanwhile, Gui Xian was not idle either. Under the guidance of Na Lan, the two once again approached e-commerce tycoon Wei Yunqi, hoping he could secure Series B funding for Magic Company. With the money, they could complete the technological upgrade and gain the shareholders' approval. Wei Yunqi perked up instantly. After all, Li Benti had screwed him over before. Early the next morning, Wen Di returned to the company and told everyone about the results of her visits to 6 or 7 companies. First of all, she believed that Li Benti had already started working behind the scenes. Therefore, basically no one dared to acquire Magic Company's shares. Just as everyone was still plotting, Gui Xian suddenly walked over. He glanced meaningfully at Wen Di. At this point, Su Jia said that they weren't even trying to sell shares. Instead, Li Benti had already launched an all-out attack on Magic Company. Therefore, discussing these matters was now pointless. Gui Xian stated that as long as they completed the Series B funding round, Li Benti's attack would fail. Everyone looked at each other in disbelief. Gao Di even mockingly gave him a thumbs down. They all believed Gui Xian was just bragging, so they remained silent and left one after another. Only Wen Di couldn't resist reminding Gui Xian before leaving that their real opponent wasn't Li Benti, but capital. When Li Benti found out that Wei Yunqi was sabotaging him behind his back, he immediately mobilized all his resources to issue a warning to the other party. Li Benti said with a serious look on his face that it was Gui Xian who had stabbed him in the back first. Wei Yunqi had no choice but to compromise. After all, self-preservation was his only way out at the moment. When two big shots fight, it is often the little guys below them who get hurt. That day, Gui Xian arrived at Wei Yunqi's residence in high spirits, thinking that his Magic Company was finally saved. But who would have thought that Wei Yunqi would suddenly announce that due to internal reasons, his investment plan would be put on hold for the time being. Therefore, Gui Xian's Series B financing would be put on hold. Seeing this, Gui Gua Xian looked at Wei Yunxi in disbelief. He then took out the carefully prepared business plan he had prepared and presented it. Even now, Gua Xian still believes that Wei Yunxi was playing him. He has no idea that Li Benti was the one behind everything. That night, Gua Xian worked overtime to develop the voice recognition feature. Just then, Li Benti showed up uninvited. After some small talk, Li Benti bluntly advised him to give up on voice recognition as soon as possible. Gua Xian was very confused by this, so the two suggested going to a night market to eat and talk. After a few drinks, Gua Xian couldn't help but lament that his shareholders were secretly selling shares behind his back. At the same time, he was well aware that these people had also approached Li Benti. Li Benti admitted it, but he did not agree with them because they were not interested in those few shares, but rather the controlling stake in Magic Company that Gua Xian held. He promised to give Gua Xian a place to stay, on the sole condition that Gua Xian sell all of Magic Company to him. The two would then work together to create a mobile internet miracle. Logically speaking, this condition was indeed tempting, but unfortunately, Gua Xian had an unusual personality. He admitted that his dream was to be an independent and autonomous person. He wanted to live his life according to his own will, without being bound by others. Therefore, he emphasized once again that he would never sell Magic Company. However, it was the small shareholders who suffered from the struggle between Gua Xian and Li Benti. Gao Di couldn't help but sigh. He was originally an angel investor who wanted to cash out and leave as soon as he made a profit. But who would have thought that he would be fooled by Gua Xian into believing that he could create a miracle, only to find himself trapped? Wen Di cut straight to the truth. And this truth was the most despairing thing for everyone. Gua Xian specially gathered several shareholders together. This was the first time he had been so generous as to treat everyone to a meal. But it was also the last time. Gua Xian went straight to the point. He knew that the shareholders had been secretly selling their shares behind his back. Although he was very unhappy about it, he still hoped that everyone would sell their shares to him. However, he had underestimated the situation, because the shares of these four people totaled $88 million. Given the current state of Magic Company's development, Gua Xian couldn't even afford a fraction of that amount. That was why the others wanted to sell their shares to outsiders. Gua Xian clasped his hands together and begged everyone to give him more time. But Su Jia replied that it wasn't a matter of time, but of trust. After all, Magic Company was truly at its end, so they didn't want to let go of their shares. Gua Xian fell silent because he knew that he couldn't raise that much money. At the same time, he was also very clear that the shareholders were only doing this to protect their own interests. Gua Xian said he understood, but the only thing that broke his heart was his ex-girlfriend Wen Di. Back then, Gua Xian had given her 5% of his shares, but now, she was trying every trick in the book to sell her shares. When his current girlfriend Na Lan found out, she was immediately unhappy. Wen Di produced a joint authorization letter claiming that the shareholders had commissioned her to sell the shares. However, Na Lan mocked her, saying that even this couldn't prove Wen Di's innocence. After all, the shareholders had been united at the beginning, but Wen Di had caused chaos as soon as she arrived, so Na Lan angrily rebuked her for stabbing them in the back and being ungrateful. Everyone can sell their shares, but you have no right to. But Wen Di turned around and accused Na Lan of being jealous of herself. Finally, Wen Di prepared to leave the office. She told Na Lan that she wasn't arguing with her. She asked Na Lan to persuade Gua Xian not to be so stubborn. Soon, Na Lan arrived at Magic Company and asked Gua Xian not to be so stubborn. Gua Xian was full of resentment. He stood up abruptly and hoped that Na Lan, Lu Ka, and himself could unite closely. Maybe there would be a silver lining. Na Lan told him to buy back the 5% of shares from Wen Di first. She knew Wen Di very well. Gua Xian heard this and put his hands on his head in despair. 5% of the shares would cost more than $5 million. He couldn't afford that kind of money right now. Na Lan angrily shouted at Gua Xian, asking him what he was still insisting on when he couldn't even get back 5% of the shares. With such a small amount of capital reserves, there would be no more miracles for Magic Company. Gua Xian had completely lost his mind. He valued Magic Company more than his own life. Na Lan looked at Gua Xian, who seemed to have gone mad. With pain in her heart, she gently wiped the tears from Gua Xian's face and softly persuaded him that he couldn't live in his own world. Today was supposed to be Lu Ka's big day, but not only did he not invite his older brother Gua Xian to be his best man, he actually invited his rival Li Benti instead. Li Benti pointed at Lu Ka's wrist and said that a man can't be without a watch. He then enthusiastically took off the expensive watch on his wrist and put it on Lu Ka's hand. Being recognized by Li Benti made Lu Ka feel a bit overwhelmed, because Lu Ka was afraid of his wife. Li Benti naturally had to curry favor with Yang Li. As soon as they met, Yang Li excitedly thanked him for coming to be her witness. After some small talk, Li Benti took out a pair of huge diamond rings and gave them to Yang Li as a wedding gift. The bridesmaids were envious and shouted with excitement. But Yang Li knew very well that she and Lu Ka were just tools for Li Benti to defeat Guai Xian. It wasn't until the wedding was about to begin that Guai Xian hurriedly arrived. He asked the two to wait for him for a moment, saying that he had two things to say. Guai Xian recalled how he met Lu Ka, and then talked about how he lost everything twice when starting his business. Fortunately, Lu Ka was very loyal and never abandoned him, staying by his side to help him achieve his dream. This was his third attempt at starting a business. Fortunately, everyone present was making money, so Guai Xian didn't think he owed them anything. It was supposed to be a dramatic story, but everyone was unable to feel happy. After all, at that time, they were truly united and happy. After saying so much, Guai Xian didn't even know what he was saying. When Guai Xian finished speaking, he couldn't help but shed tears. Lu Ka was even more saddened and kept sobbing with his head down. He and Yang Li were filled with guilt. Guai Xian had promised them that they would have a grand wedding in the future. With a choked voice, he wished the couple a happy marriage and hoped that they would understand him. Lu Ka said that since Guai Xian had told him the truth, he would no longer hide anything from him. He said that once Magic Company went bankrupt, he would go to Li Benti's company to develop his career. Guai Xian turned back with a bitter smile and left sadly. Magic Company had gone through many ups and downs and had almost gone bankrupt several times. But Guai Xian had never cried. But when Lu Ka got married, Guai Xian shed tears. What made him sad was not that Lu Ka and Yang Li had sold their shares behind his back, but that his two best friends were getting married and he couldn't be their witness. They had invited Li Benti, who was more powerful and prestigious than him. No one cared who Guai Xian was anymore. Seeing this, I couldn't help but think of when Lu Ka was framed and sent to prison, and the scene where Guai Xian was willing to give up the entire company to save him. On Lu Ka and Yang Li's wedding day, Guai Xian was in Na Lan's room crying bitterly while looking at a dog. He lamented that sometimes people aren't as loyal as dogs, but Na Lan believed that Lu Ka had already done everything he could for him. At that moment, Guai Xian bitterly blamed women for everything. Lu Ka must have been swayed by Yang Li's words to act this way. Back when he first divorced, only Lu Ka was there for him every day. Guai Xian's plight is truly heartbreaking. He once sacrificed his entire magic company for his brother. Now that his brother has abandoned him, even if he were to fight alone and win the kingdom, what would it all mean? The scene shifts to Lu Ka and Yang Li's wedding chamber. Lu Ka feels deeply guilty, but Yang Li reassures him that Guai Xian couldn't possibly support them for the rest of their lives. Besides, Lu Ka is now a married man with a family. He can't wait for the magic company to collapse before resuming his job search. Just as the two are still wallowing in sadness, the doorbell rings suddenly. Upon opening the door, they discover three unwelcome guests standing there. The incident stems from Lu Ka being framed and imprisoned by these individuals. This matter is closely tied to the fate of their entire family. For this, Jin Jinghua sincerely apologized to Lu Ka and said he had brought his good-for-nothing son along today. The butler then stepped forward and placed several property deeds in front of Lu Ka. Jin Jinghua explained that these were several vacant properties he owned in the heart of Beijing, which he wished to give to the couple as a wedding gift, hoping Lu Ka would not refuse. Though the gift was tempting, Lu Ka couldn't bring himself to accept it. Jin Jinghua also decided not to hold back any longer and calmly said that he wanted to make a deal with Lu Ka. Since Hu Wei's case was still under investigation, he hoped to send Lu Ka abroad for a year or so, without him as the party involved. It would be easier for him to mediate. The butler said that they would send Lu Ka abroad in the next few days, but Yang Li must remain in the country. Everyone could see that Jin Jinghua was threatening Lu Ka. However, the couple couldn't do anything about it. After all, the people in front of them were ruthless and had blood on their hands, and an ironic scene was about to unfold. Lu Ka and his wife showed up at Guai Xian's place with the property deed, watch, and diamond ring. They stood there like children who had done something wrong, not uttering a word, because now, only Guai Xian could save them. On one hand, Guai Xian wasn't afraid of the other party. On the other hand, Na Lan's father, Na Guomin, could help them resolve the matter. Yang Li said he had discussed it with Lu Ka and would return the watch and diamond ring to Li Benti tomorrow. We'll stay together no matter how difficult it gets. We won't separate, even if we have to die together. Guai Xian said sadly that if the magic company really went bankrupt, Lu Ka going to Li Benti was indeed the best choice. Lu Ka was speechless and stood frozen in place. At the same time, he felt particularly sorry for Guai Xian, so after Yang Li and Na Lan left, he promised Guai Xian that if she didn't reject him, he would come back and work for her without hesitation. Unfortunately, Everything had changed. Now that he had escaped from a life of suffering, he might as well live a good life with Yang Li. For this, Gui Xian sincerely thanked Lu Ka for his companionship over the years, but Lu Ka thought that he was not worthy and admitted that he was actually quite dark inside. He had worked hard and even put all his heart and soul into accompanying Gui Xian to build Magic Company into a world-renowned software company. But in the end, he was not mine because the person on stage had always been you. Gui Xian was puzzled that Lu Ka would have such thoughts and that he had never noticed it before. Lu Ka told her without reservation why he was leaving. Part of it was because of Yang Li. But the most important reason was that Gui Xian was a genius, while he was just a craftsman. After hearing this, Gui Xian fell into deep thought. Although in his heart, Magic Company had always belonged to the two of them, the fact was that he alone had taken all the glory. Lu Ka also admitted that he had always been jealous of Gui Xian. He just hoped that Gui Xian wouldn't take it to heart. Although they both felt much better after talking it out, the rift in their hearts could not be erased, so they could only silently wish each other well for the future. Due to Jin Jingguo's severe heart condition, he did not feel comfortable handing over his billion-dollar fortune to his good-for-nothing son. So, after Jin Fei was released on bail, Jin Jingguo immediately had a lawyer draft a contract and asked his son to sign it. It was a transfer agreement stating that Jin Fei would give up all the property under his name and transfer it to a family fund based in Buenos Aires. At this point, Jin Fei was still resentful and angry, causing Jin Jingguo to stand up and rebuke him. He had been determined to groom him to be his successor, but he had gambled away the fate of the entire family for a woman. Jin Fei was completely beyond redemption. Jin Jingguo had no choice but to find someone he could rely on. He never imagined that it would be Wendy, whom he had only spoken to a few times. At first, Jin Jingguo was relatively tactful, simply saying that he had a job to recommend to Wendy. Wendy declined, saying that she lacked management experience, but in reality, she still had illusions about Luofei Company. He even said that Jin Fei had always had a good impression of Wendy. What kind of melodramatic plot twist was this? Jin Jingguo also said that he had investigated Wendy's background, and that she was a clear-headed and quick-thinking woman who had no plans to get married. Jin Jingguo advised her not to overthink things. The reason was simple. He would keep Jin Fei close by and keep her in line for the next few years. Wendy was naturally tempted by the prospect of getting 300 million if the deal went through. Gui Xian never imagined that the company he had worked so hard to build would end up becoming a stepping stone for someone else. Without his dreams or his brother, he had lost all confidence in life. Every day, he would sit in his soon-to-be bankrupt company in a daze. Fortunately, his girlfriend Na Lan appeared in time, not only helping him dissolve the company's employees, but also handling the subsequent aftermath. After everything was done, she knelt down in front of Gui Xian and comforted him to cheer up. Gui Xian naturally didn't want to attend because the two main protagonists of this press conference had a blood feud with him. Under Na Lan's encouragement, Gui Xian eventually attended the banquet. At the event, Gui Xian saw several former shareholders of his company. Although he felt a mix of emotions, he forced a smile and greeted them. After many days, Lu Ka and Yang Yang had already started working at Li Benti's company. Li Benti had even given them a long honeymoon leave. Gui Xian bid farewell to them with a calm smile. In truth, he didn't harbor much resentment toward them. He knew that even if the shareholders hadn't betrayed him, the software he developed would have been replaced anyway. Just as he was talking with them, the despicable Wei Yunqi suddenly called him aside. After all, he had repeatedly promised to help Gui Xian, but in the end, he broke his promise many times for his own benefit. Now that he had tasted the sweetness of victory, he came over to apologize. Perhaps this was the true face of capitalists. Wei Yunqi even summarized the reasons for Gui Xian's failure, saying that he was burdened by too much emotion and sense of duty, and someone like Gui Xian, who was so pure and stubborn, was destined to fail in the end. Na Lan spoke boldly. You didn't invest any money, so don't lecture us here. If it weren't for Wei Yunqi's broken promises, perhaps Gui Xian wouldn't have ended up in such a situation. Soon, the banquet began, and Li Benti invited Gui Xian to the stage. Gui Xian was a lonely hero. He was a naive, passionate idealist with the heart of a child. Like most of us, he once had dreams. He endured countless hardships and trials but remained true to his original aspirations. Alas, the harsh realities of society were unforgiving. Gui Xian poured all his thoughts into this poem. Through the darkness that shrouds me, I see layers of darkness. I thank heaven for giving me an indomitable soul. Even if hell holds me tightly, I have never retreated or begged. Despite the blows of fate, I am covered in blood but hold my head high. In the world of anger and sorrow, what stands tall are only terrifying shadows. Facing the threats of the future, I fear nothing, no matter how narrow the door of fate may be. No matter what punishment I endure, I am the master of my destiny, the commander of my soul." The audience erupted into enthusiastic applause. Gui Xian's partner also shed tears. Though the man had failed in his business venture, his girlfriend was happier than anyone else, because he could finally focus on his relationship. Soon, Nalan brought Gui Xian to the lovers' bar. Gui Xian felt a little excited inside, but when he turned his head and heard the thunderous cheers from the stadium below, a feeling of loss suddenly welled up in his heart. He felt that fans would always cheer for the winners. It was as if he had kicked open the door to the mobile internet. But it wasn't him standing in the center of the stage being praised and cheered by everyone. Nalan quickly changed the subject and muttered the poem Gui Xian recited at the press conference that day. One line said, "Every ending is a new beginning." So Nalan wanted to know what Gui Xian's new beginning would be. After hesitating for a moment, Gui Xian looked at Nalan fondly and said slowly, "I've finished writing all the magic software programs. From now on, I will only write one more program in my life. That program is Nalan." Gui Xian didn't hesitate to say that if he had a ring on him right now, he would propose immediately. At that moment, the emotions they had been suppressing for so long finally erupted like a floodgate opening. Gui Xian and Nalan kissed sweetly. After a long embrace, Gui Xian held Nalan's hand and walked her home. Speaking of Gui Xian, this guy is quite lucky in love. After his divorce, he not only had a relationship with Wendy, but now he is also involved with Nalan. This feeling is unprecedented. The two of them arrived at the door of Nalan's house and were still reluctant to part. Gui Xian realized that although he had lost the magic company, at least he still had Nalan, so there was nothing to regret. That day, Gui Xian, who was drunk, lay on the bed acting drunk. He wanted to take advantage of Nalan while she was drunk, because in front of Nalan, he recalled their dreamlike emotional journey word for word. He remembered that they had never met before, but they had built a relationship through just 3 phone calls. At the time, Nalan didn't even know Gui Xian, but Gui Xian was still enthusiastic and introduced himself freely. He also excitedly described the beautiful scenery of Tibet to her. At first, Nalan was a bit confused, but gradually, she began to feel that he was not only funny but also adorably naive. Coincidentally, Nalan was also a passionate traveler. Every time Gui Xian described the beauty of Tibet, she felt as though she were there herself, and it was this mysterious and intangible feeling that made her increasingly interested in Gui Xian. Soon, it was time for their third contact, and this time, it was the most crucial factor in the rapid escalation of their feelings. Gui Xian still challenged the Valley of Death. However, when passing through a rocky area, several ferocious wolves suddenly appeared before his eyes. Gui Xian was so scared that he desperately cried for help. Just when he thought he was doomed, a Tibetan uncle named Duo Jie suddenly appeared. After being rescued, Gui Xian spent the night at Duo Jie's house. That night, the old man told him a lot about the channel. Gui Xian benefited greatly from this. The next day, he knelt down to thank Duo Jie for saving his life and hurried back to the camp. When he turned on his computer, he saw 100 voice messages from Nalan. Gui Xian looked at Nalan with a happy expression. Not only had Nalan given him great help in his career, but she was also completely devoted to their relationship. The next morning, Gui Xian apologized to Nalan for his drunken behavior the night before. Nalan told him to eat breakfast and then take her to Tibet. Arriving in Tibet, the place closest to the sky, it was like entering another world. The mysterious clouds and mist formed a fairyland-like scene through the gaps in the snow-capped mountains, intoxicating everyone. These towering snow-capped mountains reflected in the blue sky gave people a magnificent yet peaceful feeling. 2 years later, Gui Xian brought Nalan back to Uncle Duo Jie's stone house. But when he opened the door, he found the house completely empty. Gui Xian felt a sense of loss, as he had completely lost faith in life at that time. It was Duo Jie's profound teachings that gave him the courage to create magic, a world-class software. Nalan noticed Gui Xian's low spirits and immediately walked up to him, wrapping his arms around his shoulders. Their relationship was like their entrepreneurial journey. Gui Xian admired Nalan's talent, and Nalan appreciated Gui Xian's leadership skills. Through their constant collaboration, they deepened their understanding and trust of each other, encouraging, supporting, and understanding one another. Together, they overcame the various challenges of both their entrepreneurial journey and their personal lives. The two of them eventually arrived at a lakeside in Lhasa. The Tibetans said that making a wish here was particularly effective, but a person could only make one wish in their lifetime. Gui Xian had already made his wish 2 years ago. Nalan was curious about what he had wished for. "I wished that I could turn the magic software into a reality," he said. "If I can make the magic software work and still be with you, That would be perfect. Nalan smiled slightly, standing by the rippling waters of Lake Laswalamu, facing the majestic snow-capped mountains in the distance, and made her wish with all her heart. Gui Xian stood beside her, watching quietly. After Nalan finished making her wish, Gui Xian couldn't wait to walk up to her and ask what she had wished for. I hope you can make software that's even better than magic. A warm feeling welled up in Gui Xian's heart. He didn't expect Nalan to give her only wish to him. How could anyone not love a woman like this? Finally, Gui Xian couldn't help but walk up to Nalan and give her a sweet kiss.